Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
Getting ready to talk about the ghetto right on through here. Yeah.
I took the tapes home with me. They were considered to be landmark television because we don't have very many, or have not had very many, dramas depicting black life in this country. And so it was considered to be a very important step in television. So I took them home. Laurel Avenue starts out with a welfare mother who is getting off drugs, who's just gotten off drugs, and her son is selling crack. She finds the crack under his pillow. He carries a gun. All the stereotypes that you have seen before, and it builds, and it's very, very well done, very richly textured. Still can't get beyond the subject matter. And then Strapped is about a former drug dealer whose 7-month pregnant girlfriend has gotten into jail because she was selling crack, and so he decides to start selling guns in order to get her out of jail. So these were the two shows that were to build this story about what is considered to be the quote-unquote new realism in portraying black people on television. I got them home, I looked at them, and throughout I kept thinking to myself, why don't I like this? Why don't I feel comfortable with this? And obviously, now that I've described them to you, you can probably imagine why. So that is when I then went back and said that this is not necessarily what a lot of black people want to see, or what a lot of black people would probably consider progress. And I began doing all this other reporting and found out that many black directors and many black producers feel the same way and have a very difficult time getting anything that they consider balanced on television. It's hard to get financing for what they want. It's very difficult to get support, and even when you do, there's a constant steamroller pushing you to move toward the stereotypes. I'll tell you one thing that Kevin Hooks, who was the director of several shows like St. Elsewhere and China Beach and several others, he said that he was making a film in Harlem. It was a beautiful street, 114th Street, I believe it was, near Morningside Park, very pristine block, and he brought the producers out to look at the set as he built it up and made it look nice. And the producer said, well, can you put some litter or some trash around so that it'll look realistic, so that the viewers will recognize this as Harlem? He didn't. But that gives you a sense of, even when people are in a black community, this is a black community he was in, the societal perceptions of us so drive a lot of this that it's hard to get around that. When I talked with Malcolm Jamal Warner, he said that on the last show that he was on, Here and Now, he was constantly asked by the producers and director to slap his sidekick on the back of the head whenever he said anything funny or stupid. And that's among the many things that I noticed as I watched these 12 or 15 hours of tapes. You see a tremendous amount, if you watch in concentration, and if you watch these shows from Hanging with Mr. Cooper to Where I Live to Martin to Fresh Prince, all these different shows, you'll notice violence, even among so-called middle-class proper people. You'll see people hitting each other, threatening to hit, kick, talking about hitting, bopping you on the head. It doesn't matter what it is, that all comes out. Almost every show seems to have, in order to be legitimate and realistic, a sidekick with the hat on sideways, backward, pimp walking through the show. That's one thing you'll see, and I'm sure you all know that from Martin. And there has to be a sense that in order to be realistic, you have to be a little hip-hop. You have to have be just on the edge of criminality, and that's always suggested. I found that in reporting all of this, the people that I talked with expressed a tremendous amount of frustration, the directors. One director or producer who you all know, Rock, Charles Dutton, said that if the two boys who did Menace to Society had come to the producers or to the networks, to the studios and said, we'd like to do something called Contributors to Society about two boys who wanted to go to college, it would never have been made. And that's where we are right now. On television, what we're seeing now is sort of a post-Cosby backlash where there's an effort to just get almost anything black out there. And in fact, we have probably more television shows about black people on television now than at any other time. But, of course, quantity doesn't always mean quality, and that's where we are, too. I'll just leave you with one other thing, another observation that Tim Reed made to me. This is all in the article. And that was, he broke it down in terms of the numbers. And he said that if you think of all the black people, 30 million or so black people in this country, about half of them would be men, or slightly less than half would be men. Of those, maybe about a third to a fourth would be young black men between the ages of 18 and 25 or whatever. And of those, not all of them are selling drugs and in jail or on the streets. So that, and we know the popularly cited number about 1 in 4 being in jail. So that what we're left with is 1 or 2 million people in this country driving the entire media image of all black people. And I think many of the black directors and producers I talked to, and probably everybody in this room, would say that what we need more of is balance. And I'll leave you with that.
Context of White Supremacy. Justice Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, October 11th, 2013. So I have been told. The sound clip that we began the broadcast with 20 years ago, Isabel Wilkerson, she was a part of a panel discussion on black people in the media. This is on C-SPAN. You can see the full broadcast. This is from September 16th, 1993, on the negative representations of black people in film, television programs. I feel like that's something we've been talking about for a long time. It was a very interesting panel. I think she had some great points to illustrate. At any rate, we'll be back tomorrow. Compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, and 6 p.m. Pacific. Workplace racism and other thoughts, current events, things that have been happening on the plantation over the past 7 days. We will also have Dr. Tommy Curry on the program this coming Monday. That would be October 14th, same program time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. We are doing our fundraiser for the month of October. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. The 12th installment of our study sessions on Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. We left last week. There was a white terrorist mob in Chicago ready to abuse, harm, assault an unarmed, innocent black family, simply looking to improve their quality of life. We will get right to it. First audio installment, Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, Context of White Supremacy.
They chanted, "Go, go, go, go." They hurled rocks and bricks. They looted. Then they firebombed the whole building. The bombing gutted the 20-unit building and forced even the white tenants out. They chanted, "Go, go, go, go." They hurled rocks and bricks. They looted. Then they firebombed the whole building. The bombing gutted the 20-unit building and forced even the white tenants out. The rioters overturned police cars and threw stones at the firefighters who were trying to put out the blaze. Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson had to call in the National Guard, the first time the Guard had been summoned for a racial incident since the 1919 riots in the early years of the migration. It took 4 hours for more than 600 guardsmen, police officers, and sheriff's deputies to beat back the mob that night, and 3 more days for the rioting over the Clarks to subside. A total of 118 men were arrested in the riot. A Cook County grand jury failed to indict any of the rioters. Town officials did not blame the mob for the riot, but rather the people who, in their view, should never have rented the apartment to the Clarks in the first place. To make an example of such people, indictments were handed down against the rental agent, the owner of the apartment building, and others who had helped the Clarks on charges of inciting a riot. The indictments were later dropped. In spite of everything, the Clarks still felt they had a right to live in a city with good, affordable housing stock, but the racial hostility made it all but impossible to return. Walter White, the longtime leader of the NAACP, kept close watch of the case. He had been challenging Jim Crow since the 1920s and compared the hatred he saw in the Cicero mob to the lynch mobs he had seen in the South. It was appalling to see and listen to those who were but recently the targets of hate and deprivations, he said, who, beneficiaries of American opportunity, were as virulent as any Mississippian in their willingness to deny a place to live to a member of a race which had preceded them to America by many generations. It was the middle of the Cold War, and the famous columnist and broadcaster of the day, Walter Winchell, weighed in on what he called the bigoted idiots out there who did as much for Stalin as though they had enlisted in the Red Army. That fall, Governor Stevenson, who would go on to become the Democratic nominee for president the following year, told a newly convened state commission on human rights that housing segregation was putting pressure on the whole system. "This is the root of the Cicero affair," the governor said, "the grim reality underlying the tension and violence that accompany the efforts of minority groups to break through the Iron Curtain." The Cicero riot attracted worldwide attention. It was front-page news in Southeast Asia, made it into the Pakistan Observer, and was remarked upon in West Africa. A resident of Accra wrote to the mayor of Cicero, according to Hirsch, protesting the mob's savagery and asking for an apology to the civilized world. It was U.S. Attorney Otto Kerner, whose job it was to prosecute the federal case against the Cicero officials accused of denying the Clarks their civil rights. Kerner's name would later become linked to one of the most cited reports on race relations in this country. President Lyndon Johnson chose him to head a federal investigation into the racial disturbances of the 1960s. The Commission's findings, released in February 1968 as the report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, would come to be known as the Kerner Report. Its recommendations would be revisited for decades as a measure of the country's progress toward equality, its stark pronouncement invoked many times over. "Our nation is moving toward two societies," the report said, "one black, one white, separate and unequal." Well into the 20th century, Cicero would remain synonymous with intolerance and corruption. It would come to be seen in the same light as other symbolic places, like Ocoee, Florida, or Forsyth County, Georgia, where many blacks dared not think of living and thought twice before even driving through, well into the 1990s. By then, Cicero was racked by a series of scandals involving a mayor who would ultimately serve prison time on federal corruption charges. Even white immigrant families were leaving Cicero, ceding it to Mexican immigrants. In 2000, the U.S. Census found that of Cicero's population of 85,616, just 1% of the residents were black, nearly half a century after the riots that kept the Clarks from moving in. It was an article of faith among many people in Chicago and other big cities that the arrival of colored people in an all-white neighborhood automatically lowered property values. That economic fear was helping propel the violent defense of white neighborhoods. The fears were not unfounded, but often not for the reasons white residents were led to believe, sociologists, economists, and historians have found. And the misunderstanding of the larger forces at work and the scapegoating of colored migrants, those with the least power of all, made the violence all the more tragic. Contrary to conventional wisdom, the decline in property values and neighborhood prestige was a byproduct of the fear and tension itself, sociologists found. The decline often began, they noted, in barely perceptible ways before the first colored buyer moved in. The instability of a white neighborhood under pressure from the very possibility of integration put the neighborhood into a kind of real estate purgatory. It set off a downward cycle of anticipation, in which worried whites no longer bought homes in white neighborhoods that might one day attract colored residents, even if none lived there at the time. Rents and purchase prices were dropped in a futile attempt to attract white residents, as Hirsch put it. With prices falling and the neighborhood's future uncertain, lenders refused to grant mortgages or made them more difficult to obtain. Panicked whites sold at low prices to salvage what equity they had left, giving the homeowners who remained little incentive to invest any further to keep up or improve their properties. Thus, many white neighborhoods began declining before colored residents even arrived, Hirsch noted. There emerged a perfect storm of nervous owners, falling prices, vacancies unfillable with white tenants or buyers, and a market of colored buyers who may not have been able to afford the neighborhood at first, but now could with prices within their reach. The arrival of colored home buyers was often the final verdict on a neighborhood's falling property value, rather than the cause of it. Many colored people, already facing wage disparities, either could not have afforded a neighborhood on the rise, or would not have been granted mortgages except by lenders and sellers with their backs against the wall. It was the falling home values that made it possible for colored people to move in at all. The downward spiral created a vacuum that speculators could exploit for their own gain. They could scoop up properties in potentially unstable white neighborhoods and extract higher prices from colored people who were anxious to get in and were accustomed to being overcharged in the Black Belt. The panic peddler and the respectable broker earned the greatest profits, Hirsch wrote, from the greatest degree of white desperation. It seemed as if little had changed from the hostilities of the early years of the migration, when colored tenants on Vincennes Avenue got the following notice. "We are going to blow these flats to hell, and if you don't want to go with them, you had better move at once. Only one warning." The letter writers carried out their threat. 3 bombs exploded over the following 2 weeks. 30 years later, things were no better, and may actually have been worse, as the Black Belt strained to hold the migrants still pouring in, even as the borders with white neighborhoods were being more vigorously defended. By the late 1950s, Ida Mae and George, now both working blue-collar jobs, and their children now adults and with blue-collar jobs of their own, were dreaming of finding a place where they could pool their incomes and live together under one roof. But it would be some time before they were in a position to act, or could find a safe and affordable place to go. At the same time, an urban turf war had risen up around them. Bombings, shootings, riots, or threats greeted the arrival of nearly every new colored family in white defended territory. The biggest standoffs came between the groups with the most in common, save race: the working-class white immigrants and the working-class black immigrants, both with similar backgrounds and wanting the same thing: good jobs and a decent home for their families, but one group not wanting to be anywhere near the other and literally willing to fight to the death to keep the other out. It was a chilling parallel to the war playing out at the very same time in the South, from the arrest of Rosa Parks in 1955 for refusing to give up a bus seat in Alabama, to white troops blocking 9 colored students in 1957 on their first day of school in Little Rock, Arkansas, after the Supreme Court said they had the right to enroll. After World War II, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and other northern and western cities would witness a fitful migration of whites out of their urban strongholds. The far-out precincts and the inner-ring suburbs became sanctuaries for battle-weary whites seeking, with government incentives, to replicate the havens they once had in the cities. One such suburb was Dearborn, Michigan, just outside Detroit. By the mid-1950s, Dearborn was swelling with white refugees from the city. The suburb's mayor, Orville Hubbard, told the Montgomery Advisor in Alabama that the whites had been crowded out of Detroit by the colored people. He was more than happy to welcome these new white residents and said, to the delight of Southern editorialists, "These people are so anti-colored, much more than you in Alabama." Having already fled the cities, the newcomers were not going to let colored people into their new safehold. "Negroes can't get in here," Mayor Hubbard told the Southerners. "Every time we hear of a Negro moving in, we respond quicker than you do to a fire." Decades later, the message would still hang in the air, the calculus pretty much the same. By the end of the 20th century, blacks would make up more than 80% of the population of Detroit. Just across the Ford Expressway, the black population of the suburb of Dearborn, the 2000 census found, was 1%. New York, 1963. George Swanson Starling. Every night, the violence came into George Starling's living room. He had been watching the nightly news, the grainy black-and-white images of colored teenagers standing up to Southern sheriffs, and he could see himself as a young man again, pressing against the barbed wall of the caste system in Florida. Sheriff's deputies were pounding the young people with fire hoses and beating them with batons. This was the South he left. He wondered if it would ever change. He was on the subway one morning heading to work at Pennsylvania Station in the midst of this Southern assault. He got settled in his seat and opened the newspaper. "I looked at the front page," he said, "and there's all these black people down on the ground, and dogs jumping all over them, and the cops standing over them with billies and beating on them down in Alabama on a march." Something welled up in George. Everything raced before him. The cheating foreman in the groves, his running for his life, the hangings and burnings, the little Southern dog that would rather die than be black, the bomb going off on Christmas Day under the bed of a good man trying to bring justice to Florida. And then there was New York, wide open and stifling at the same time. Yes, he was alive, but it was a slow death in a hard city. He was a baggage handler for all intents and purposes, and would be no more than that, no matter how much potential he had. The city was pressing down on him and swallowing up his children. It never failed to remind him that he was seen as alien, the Yankee bartender taking the trouble to break the glass George had drunk from rather than use it again. There was no place else to run, and now the heat was turning up in the South again. Hosing and police dogs, and people watching it as if it were a made-for-TV movie, and the blacks just having to take it like they had for generations. "I had the paper in front of my face," he said, "and I got so mad. I dropped the paper down, and when I dropped the paper, I'm looking right in a white man's face just sitting across from me. I'd never seen the man before, didn't know him from Adam, but he was white. And the hatred just surged up in me after looking at this thing in the paper. I just wanted to hurt somebody white, and I had to just really restrain myself to keep from just getting up. And that was the thing that went on during the whole campaign, as he called the civil rights movement." George got hold of himself. He pulled himself back from the edge. This thing was driving him crazy, and there was nothing he could do about it. The white man probably never had a clue. George would go about his job on the train, and no one would know the difference. But the despair did not leave him. He still had loved ones in the South. "I was worried about all my family and friends," he said. "I had a lot of people there. My father and mother were living, my brother and all the kids that I went to school with, and my wife's people. There were a lot of people that I was concerned with." He saw the fear firsthand on the faces of colored passengers heading north, and in his tense interactions with white Southerners when he worked the rails going south. As bad as it was, and as bad as it had been all those decades before, some of the most bold-faced terrors of the civil rights movement were yet to come. The bombing deaths of 4 little girls just before a Sunday church service in Birmingham, the assassinations of civil rights workers, black and white, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney and Michael Schwerner, and Medgar Evers, the confrontation on a bridge in Selma, Alabama. Those would not come until Jim Crow's fitful last hours. George kept close contact with the people back home, and like many migrants in the North, sent money to support the protests, because the migrants knew more than most anyone what the people back home were up against. One day in 1962, in the middle of the civil rights movement, he heard something that set him off again. By civil rights standards, it was a relatively small thing, and that is what drew him to it. For some reason, nothing seemed as fate-tempting and blasphemous as someone setting fire to 3 defenseless colored churches, as in Georgia in September 1962. They were razed to the ground by white supremacists bent on keeping colored people from something as basic as signing up to vote. George was raised in the church and felt it hallowed and sanctified, and the only safe place even the old slaveholders had dared not enter. It represented a breach of the most private, holy space. He read in the New York Amsterdam News that there was a drive on to raise money to rebuild the churches. He started a collection himself. He went to the underpaid cooks and baggage men and red caps and porters working the rails with him. He got 50 cents here and $1 there from people like Walter Watkins from Washington, D.C., Ralph Covington from Brooklyn, Van Truitt from the Bronx, G.T. Craig from Baltimore, J.E. Aaron of Brooklyn, and 38 other co-workers. It took him 4 weeks to raise $41. In January 1963, he walked over to the office of the Amsterdam News and handed a check in that amount to a rebuilding fund the paper was sponsoring. With George, it was never the money when it came to these things, but the sense of indignation over the injustice of it all, and about doing something, anything, and getting other people as roused up about it as he was, just like he did back in the orange groves in Florida all those years ago. He had been in Harlem and working for the railroad for 18 years now, and knew he and his co-workers could raise more than a few dollars to help fight bigotry in the region they left. The Amsterdam News soon closed the fund, figuring it had raised all it was going to get. The churches in Georgia had already begun rebuilding with donations that had come in from all over the country. But George hadn't stopped collecting money. He kept a ledger of all the men who contributed and what they contributed, each 50-cent and $1 increment, from Percy Brown of Mount Vernon, Yace Brown of Queens, Adolph Thomas of Philadelphia. In March, George showed up again at the newspaper office with a check for $44 more. "I wanted to help in the only way I know," he told the Amsterdam News. Los Angeles, August 1961. Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. Robert was in regular contact with the folks back home, and in one of his phone calls to Monroe, his big brother Madison mentioned that he was due for some upcoming surgery, what seemed on the face of it to be fairly routine, the problem being his gallbladder. But Robert, a surgeon of many years now, knew that nothing involving surgery was routine, and urged his brother to come out to California where he could get the best of medical care. Robert would make all the arrangements, and Madison wouldn't have to submit to the small-town, probably proficient but still segregated medicine back in Louisiana. "Come," Robert told him. "I don't want those white doctors in Monroe operating on you. You come out here so I'll know what kind of care you're getting." Madison had heard about the state-of-the-art facilities in Los Angeles. He knew his brother would see to it that he got the very best, That was just the way Robert was, and he couldn't help himself. So although the trip out west would be taxing, he decided to leave his wife Harriet and son Madison James in Monroe and follow his little brother's advice and come to L.A. He had confidence in me, Robert said. Robert set about planning the best medical care for his brother. He hand-picked the surgeon, board-certified, it went without saying, who was one of his most trusted friends. On the day of the operation, Robert was there in his scrubs in the operating room, serving as second assistant and watching every move. And when he picked the knife up to make the incision, Robert remembered, I closed my eyes and flinched. I felt it. I couldn't assist with that attitude. So the surgeon said, Bob, you let Palmer Reed move up and you step back so I can sponge. And I settled down. Robert stayed for the duration of the surgery. I saw everything, and it was a flawless operation. It was beautiful. There was no mistake made, none. He felt proud and vindicated that he had insisted that his big brother come out to California and that things had gone so well. To Robert, it was just one more way to prove to the brother who had stayed in the South that he had made the right decision to migrate and that things really were better in California. Robert was in a great mood and started joking with his brother that maybe he should recuperate at Robert's house or with their sister Gold, who by now Robert had lured to California too. You wasting money in a private room, Robert said. Come to my house or go live with Gold. Okay, Madison said. I'll be ready to go. I just don't feel good right now. 3 or 4 days after surgery, Madison was still saying he didn't feel good. He started sending out for antacids to relieve his abdominal pressure, but he wasn't complaining. And he didn't have any symptoms that would make us want to do anything special, Robert later said. We know there's a certain amount of discomfort you're going to have. He was taking soft foods, and he was up. He was ambulated the next day after surgery. Temperature was flat. He was doing fine. After several more days, a nurse woke Robert up one morning. Dr. Foster, this is Miss Smart. I'm calling you about Dr. Madison Foster. Yes? He went to the bathroom, Dr. Foster. Robert heard the gravity in her voice, the succinctness of her message, and knew what it meant, could read her shorthand. Madison must have strained himself, and in the straining dislodged some plaque that could be anywhere in his body, in his heart, his lungs, his brain. There was no telling where it could be. Robert got straight to the point. Is he alive? The nurse told him yes, and that they had called in several doctors to attend to him. Fine, Robert said, suspecting that it wasn't. At once he began calling in the specialists he knew, and then he rushed to the hospital. Madison's hospital room was full of doctors. They were surrounding his bedside, all working on him. And I'll never forget the look in his eyes, Robert said, his head down now. And he's looking at me, and that look in his eye was saying, Is this it? Little Bubba, he called me. Little Bub, is this it? He was so worried, and I'm crying and talking. Robert tried to comfort him. Don't worry, Bubba, Robert said. It's all right. It's going to be all right. Madison was a physician himself and knew that it wasn't. He knew I was only reassuring him, Robert would later say, because why would I be crying? Robert got on the phone with Madison's wife, Harriet, who was still awaiting word back in Monroe about how the gallbladder surgery had gone. I gave her an hour-to-hour report, he said, and that went on all day. Instead of saving his brother in California, Robert would end up sending Madison back home in a casket, the people in Monroe clucking over Robert's so-called promised land, and what a shame it all was. Harriet would hold it against him for years. Madison had died of a blood clot. That had been the source of his discomfort, and nothing, it seemed, could have prevented it. Robert would have been the first to blame the doctors if it had happened in the South, but this had been in California, and he had chosen the surgeons and seen the operation with his own eyes. Robert would blame himself for as long as he lived, torture himself with what would have happened if, and would never truly get over it. Revolutions. I can conceive of no Negro native to this country who has not, by the age of puberty, been irreparably scarred by the conditions of his life. The wonder is not that so many are ruined, but that so many survive. James Baldwin, Notes of a Native Son. Chicago, 1966. Ida Mae Brandon Gladney. One day in 1966, something hopeful called to Ida Mae, who was now 53 and a grandmother. She scuttled past the dime stores and beauty shops on 63rd Street with Eleanor's little children, Karen and Kevin, in tow. They were rushing in the direction of a quavering voice on a loudspeaker. Up ahead she could see a crowd of onlookers, the faithful and the curious, packed in the street and on the sidewalks near Halsted, and sober-faced police officers circling the crowd on horseback. She arrived late and out of breath. Years later, all she would remember was the voice saying something about little white children and little colored children, or so she thought, and all the people, hordes of them, straining to hear but tense from the police scrutiny and the vaguely dangerous nature of the moment. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was there in person and speaking before them. It was one of his rare appearances in Ida Mae's neighborhood during his first major attempt to bring the civil rights movement to the North. Ida Mae almost missed it. She arrived too late to get anywhere near the podium. Neither she nor Karen or Kevin could see over the crowd that had gathered long before them. They had him way up on something high, she said decades later, and you could hear his voice talking through those horns. Ida Mae wanted to move closer to see him. That was what she had come for, after all. I never did get close enough, she said. I didn't want to push through the crowd. Everybody was so touchy, and I had kids, you see, and I just couldn't pull them up in there. I never did get to see him good. Ida Mae was taken in by the sheer presence of the man, who by then had already won the Nobel Peace Prize, led the March on Washington, witnessed the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and overseen his epic battles against Jim Crow in places like Selma and Montgomery. But Chicago was a turning point for King. His movement was aging, its actions drawing greater skepticism, and its successes leaving him with fewer obvious dragons to slay. It was a campaign looking for a cause. The inroads into Southern segregation gave King a greater awareness of the unresolved tensions in the North in the wake of the Great Migration. Negroes have continued to flee from behind the Cotton Curtain, King told a crowd at Buckingham Fountain near the Loop, testing out a new theme in virgin territory. But now they find that after years of indifference and exploitation, Chicago has not turned out to be the new Jerusalem. Yet the very thing that made black life hard in the North, the very nature of Northern hostility, unwritten, mercurial, opaque, and eminently deniable, made it hard for King to nail down an obvious right versus wrong cause to protest. Blacks in the North could already vote and sit at a lunch counter or anywhere they wanted on an elevated train. Yet they were hemmed in and isolated into two overcrowded sections of the city, the South Side and the West Side, restricted in the jobs they could hold and the mortgages they could get, their children attending segregated and inferior schools, not by edict, as in the South, but by circumstance in the North, with the results pretty much the same. The unequal living conditions produced the expected unequal results. Blacks working long hours for overpriced flats, their children left unsupervised and open to gangs, the resulting rise in crime and drugs, with few people able to get out, and the problem so complex as to make it impossible to identify a single cause or solution. King was running headlong into what the sociologist Gunnar Myrdal called the Northern Paradox. In the North, Myrdal wrote, almost everybody is against discrimination in general. But at the same time, almost everybody practices discrimination in his own personal affairs. That is, by not allowing blacks into unions or clubhouses, certain jobs and white neighborhoods, indeed avoiding social interaction overall. It is the culmination of all these personal discriminations, he continued, which creates the color bar in the North, and for the Negro causes unusually severe unemployment, crowded housing conditions, crime, and vice. About this social process, the ordinary white Northerner keeps sublimely ignorant and unconcerned. Thus, any civil rights campaign in the North would not be an attack on outrageous laws that, with enough grit and fortitude, could be overturned with the stroke of a pen. Instead, King would be fighting the ill-defined fear and antipathy that made Northern whites flee at the sight of a black neighbor, turn away blacks at realty offices, or not hire them if they chose. The enemy was a feeling, a general unease that led to the flight of white people and businesses, and sucked the resources out of the ghettos the migrants were quarantined into. No laws could make frightened white Northerners care about blacks enough to permit them full access to the system they dominated. So long as this city is dominated by whites, whether because of their numbers, without force, or by their force if they were in the minority, the Chicago Tribune once wrote, there will be limitations placed on the black people. Still, despite the odds, King was compelled to go north, was called to it, he said, as had a good portion of his people in the still unfolding migration. He had made the journey himself when he went to Boston University for graduate school, and while there met his wife, Coretta, another Southerner. King's campaign in the North was, in one sense, simply reacting to a major shift in the epicenter of black America, the historian James R. Ralph wrote. It was following the great demographic flow of black Americans from the rural South to the urban North. King actually moved into an apartment in the most hard-scrabble section of town, the West Side neighborhood of North Lawndale, where the poorest and most recent arrivals from the South had shakily established themselves. He had a chess-like series of encounters with Mayor Richard J. Daley, the mayor boss of Chicago, who managed to outwit the civil rights leader at nearly every turn. For one thing, Daley knew not to make the same mistakes as his Southern counterparts. He met with King, appearing cooperative rather than ignoring him or having him thrown into jail. He vowed to protect the marchers with a heavy police presence that sometimes outnumbered the marchers. It worked so well that the protesters rarely had the chance to contrast their peaceable courage against foaming-at-the-mouth supremacists, because Daley's police force didn't let any white mob get near them, which kept the protests off the news and kept the movement from gaining traction, just as Daley had hoped. That is, until after months of build-up, King went to march against housing segregation in a neighborhood called Marquette Park on the city's southwest side. This was a working-class neighborhood of Poles, Lithuanians, Germans, and Italians who had not long since gotten their starter bungalows and were standing their ground against the very thought of colored people moving in. It was August 5th, 1966. A fist-shaking crowd of some 4,000 residents had gathered in advance. Upon his arrival, they cursed King with epithets from a knoll overlooking the march. Many people in the crowd waved Confederate flags. Some wore Nazi-like helmets. One placard read, "King would look good with a knife in his back." The march had barely begun when a heckler hurled a rock as big as a fist at King, striking him in the head, just above the right ear. He fell to his knees, and as he tried to get up, the crowd pelted the demonstrators with bottles, eggs, firecrackers, and more rocks. Some in the crowd turned and smashed rocks into cars and buses that passed with colored people in them. Some 1,200 police officers and 200 plainclothesmen had gathered in anticipation of trouble, but this was one of the rare occasions that they were outnumbered by white residents primed for confrontation. As the 800 King supporters tried to carry on the march, They passed men, women, and children on their front stoops, who called the marchers cannibals, savages, and worse. A column of 300 jeering white teenagers sat in the middle of the street to block the marchers' path. The police dispersed the youths with nightsticks waving, and the march was able to resume. But the teenagers repositioned themselves half a block down and sat in the street again. It took a second charge from the police to break up the young hecklers. When the march wound down, the mob chased the buses carrying King's people away. Rising in agitation that lasted for hours, the mob smashed an effigy of King, overturned a car on Marquette Road, stoned other cars, and fought police trying to clear the place out, requiring reinforcements to beat the mob back with clubs and shots fired into the air. In the end, some 30 people were injured and 40 were arrested. Some of King's aides had warned him not to go to Chicago. He said he had to. "I have to do this," he said as he tried to steady himself after the stoning, "to expose myself, to bring this hate into the open." He had marched in the deepest corners of Alabama, but was unprepared for what he was in for in Chicago. "I have seen many demonstrations in the South," he said that violent day in the Promised Land, "but I have never seen anything so hostile and so hateful as I've seen here today." Ida May watched it on the news that night and worried for the man she so badly had wanted to see. She expected this in Mississippi, not in the North. "No," she would say decades afterward. "Some places I just trusted more than others." New York, Pennsylvania Station, mid-1960s. George Swanson Starling. The world was changing, and George, without trying, was on the front lines. In the South, the trains had been segregated for as long as most people had been alive. Now he was in the uncomfortable position of enforcing new laws that were just now filtering into everyday practice. There he was, scanning the crowds on the railroad platform as the southbound Silver Comet stretched down the track, belching and ready to board. The train would pull out of the station at 12:45 en route to Birmingham with some 28 stops in between. Passengers packed the railway platform, suitcases, hat boxes, overnighters, trunks, briefcases, and Gimbel's shopping bags at their feet. George went about his job of getting their luggage and helping them to their seats, but this time he looked the passengers over in a way he never did before. He looked to see if they were in prim Sunday clothes or loud juke-joint get-ups, if the people seeing them off were self-contained New Yorkers bidding people goodbye, or excitable Southerners still new to the spectacle. He checked to see if they haughtily took to their reserved seats in the integrated rail car as if they owned it, or if they were wide-eyed and tentative about sitting in the same section as the white passengers. George was paying close attention because this was the mid-1960s. The trains in the North had always been integrated, but blacks had to move to separate cars before being permitted into the South. During the run between New York and Alabama, it had been George's job to move the colored passengers from their seats in the white section and into the Jim Crow car before crossing from Washington into the segregated state of Virginia. But after the sit-ins and marches in the South, things were beginning to change. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act on July 2, 1964, 101 years after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, granting rights that would have to be spelled out again long after Lincoln was gone. Now blacks were entitled to the same privileges as any other citizens. They were not to be segregated in any sphere in life. But it would take time, up to a decade or more, for the message to sink in to those who chose not to recognize the new law. In addition, it was not as if a copy of the Civil Rights Act went out to every black household. Some didn't know what their new rights were exactly, and had lived under the old order for so long that they were tentative about testing out the new one. In public conveyances, it fell to workers like George Starling, if they were so inclined, which it so happened he was, to alert their fellow migrants to rights they weren't certain they could assert. On the train, it meant negotiating the tricky business of reorienting the black passengers when the train passed into or out of what had been Jim Crow territory. For as long as most anyone alive could remember, this was the way things had worked on the railroad. A black passenger boarding a southbound train at, say, Pennsylvania Station in New York would be assigned a seat anywhere on the train and could sit there without a second thought until the train reached the border city of Washington, D.C. From the time of Reconstruction in the 1870s, Washington had been the dividing line between the free North and the segregated South. Black passengers getting off in Washington had nothing to worry about. But for those continuing south, the crews who ran the train, the porters who helped passengers on and off, and the black passengers themselves knew to gather their things and move to the Jim Crow car up front to make sure the races were separated when the train crossed into the state of Virginia. The civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s changed all that, or was intended to, but custom had a way of lingering well after the ink was dry. So in the transition to integration, black passengers were not automatically granted the right to keep their seats, no matter what their ticket or President Johnson said. George was on the front lines in these early days of integration, when some conductors, many of them Southern, held close the old traditions and ordered porters like George to move the colored passengers into the Jim Crow car, no matter the law. Some conductors, like many other Southerners, resented the new laws that had been forced upon them. Others could always say that white Southerners boarding the train below Washington were still not comfortable riding in the same coach as black people and might kick up a fuss. As the train drew closer to Washington, the conductor gave George a passenger manifest identifying the passengers he wanted moved to the old Jim Crow car, meaning all the black passengers traveling below Washington. George knew it wasn't right and began discreetly approaching colored passengers as the train pulled out of Baltimore en route to Washington. He tried to alert them to what was about to happen and let them know they had a right to stay where they were. But it was a perilous act on his part. The passengers might get scared and turn him in. He might be accused of inciting the passengers and disrupting the orderly relocation of passengers who didn't mind moving. It was especially dangerous because he was not heading north on the train, but south into what might be considered enemy territory. Either way, he could be fired for what he was doing. He knew he couldn't be seen openly advising black passengers to defy the conductor's orders. So from the moment he boarded the train in New York and began waiting on the black passengers in his charge, he paid close attention to them, scrutinized them to see which ones might be more receptive. Then, as the train rumbled toward Union Station in Washington, and when he had made certain that the conductor wasn't around, he began approaching colored passengers one by one. He leaned over the seat and began speaking in whispers. "Look," he told them, "what I want to say to you is confidential between you and me. If you don't think you can keep it confidential, let me know now, and I won't say any more. But it's to your benefit." Okay. Then he would explain the situation. "We're now going below Washington," he would tell them. "They want us to move y'all up front in the Jim Crow car. But you have paid for a seat to wherever you're going. You paid an extra fee to reserve this seat, and you're entitled to keep this seat to your point of destination. But they're not going to tell you that. They're going to tell you you got to move up front." He waited for their response, checked for a show of interest and curiosity instead of fear and distrust. Then he would know whether to proceed. If he felt safe, he would go on. "What you do," he continued, "is tell them that you don't care to move. Just tell them that." Then he told them what to expect and gave them a little script. "They're going to give you an argument," he said, "but just tell them, 'Look, I have a reserved seat here from New York to Jacksonville. Washington isn't my destination, and I'm not moving anywhere. Now, if you want me to move, you get the cops and come and move me. I'm not voluntarily moving anywhere." He reassured them that they were within their rights. "They're not going to bother you," he told them, "because they know if you got nerve enough to tell them that you're not going to move, and if they force you to move, that they have a suit on their hands." But it occurred to him that he needed to protect himself. He couldn't give any appearance of undermining the conductor's orders or inspiring the black passengers to do something that would otherwise never occur to them. So he admonished them further. "And don't go telling them, 'Well, the attendant told me I didn't have to move,'" George said, "or you'll get me killed. Just tell them you're not going to move. They're not going to move you." Some of them got scared at that kind of talk, so George gave them an out. "If you feel more comfortable and you think you should go on up to that Jim Crow car when you have paid to ride like everybody else, then you go," he said. "I'll move you." He forewarned them that if they decided to take the chance, they should know that he would have to feign indifference, pretend to have no knowledge of the matter if the conductor got involved. "He's going to be telling me to take you up front, and you're going to be telling him that you're not going, and I'm going to just be standing there. I'm going to be saying, 'No, I ain't got nothing to do with it.'" By the time the train got halfway to Washington, he had a good idea of who he had in the rail car with him, and which of them might be safe to approach. "You could tell just by who brings them to the station," he said, "how they depart, the conversations." But sometimes he would misjudge a passenger and come close to getting caught. Some passengers would loud talk him. "What? What the hell you talking about?" they'd ask, not comprehending his plan. George would speak in an even quieter whisper to get their voices down, which only meant they couldn't hear him and made them ask more questions, even louder than before. "What? I don't have to move? How come I don't have to move?" George would just shake his head and step away. "You know to leave them alone," he said. What gave George the greatest sense of defeat were the people who went up to the Jim Crow car anyway. "They move anyway to avoid trouble," he said. "Quite a few would move up because the other attendants, they wouldn't tell the people. They wouldn't go to 'em like I would. Some of them would even support the conductor in telling them, 'You better move. You gotta move.'" George didn't see it that way, and after all he had been through in the South, and even in the North, he felt it his duty to let the people know. It was the same George who tried to rouse the fruit pickers some 20 years before to get them to stand up for what was due them. In this case on the train, George was fortunate. "None of them ever exposed me," he said. And what's more, of the cases he saw, the people who resisted got to stay in their rightful seats. Every incident that came up, George said, they left them alone. Chicago, Spring 1967. Ida Mae Brandon Gladney. It had been close to 30 years since Ida Mae and her family had come up north. The children were grown now, and by the late 1950s, the first generation born in the north had arrived. Eleanor, who had come north in Ida Mae's belly, had gotten married right out of high school and had 2 kids. James and his wife, Mary Ann, soon followed with 4 kids of their own. Ida Mae held the babies close and prayed for the first members of the family, born free in the Promised Land. There were different branches now, and they were getting by, but still renting and not settled in a place of their own. From flat to flat, in and around the straining borders of the South Side, Ida Mae and her family had moved more in Chicago than they had when they were sharecroppers in Mississippi, as they had never moved in Mississippi like some of the people they knew, because they had always stayed with their one planter, Mr. Ed. They had lived at 21st and State, 33rd and State, 45th and St. Lawrence, and were now in the 700 block of West 66th Place. They had been all over the South Side. They felt they had been in Chicago long enough without owning something. George had been at Campbell Soup for years. Ida Mae was working as a nurse's aide at Walther Memorial Hospital. Velma was teaching. James was driving a bus for the Chicago Transit Authority. Eleanor was a ticket agent for the elevated train. So together they had enough to put something down on some property. Not unlike many immigrant families, they wanted to stay together and wanted a place big enough for all of them. Their search led them to a beige brick 3-flat in a long contested, but they believed, newly opened-up neighborhood called South Shore on the southern tip of the Black Belt. It was a few blocks west of Lake Michigan. The street was lined with oak trees along the sidewalk and brick bungalows and multiflats with little patches of yard in front. They went to see the place at night. An Italian car salesman and his family lived there. It had room enough for James and his family on the first floor, Ida Mae and her husband on the second, Eleanor and her kids on the third, or, if necessary, a tenant to help with the house payments. Ida Mae and her family didn't have enough furniture to fill the flat. They wanted the place and everything in it. The plastic-covered upholstery, the marble-topped coffee table, the lamps, the dining room table, the break front and buffet, and the baby blue draperies over the front windows. The Italian car salesman said he liked them and wanted them to have it. The family paid $30,000 and moved in without incident. There was the little matter of a bullet hole in one of the windows in the front room, but Ida Mae didn't let it bother her, as it appeared the shot had been fired sometime before they moved in. 30 years after they arrived in the New World, with little more than their kids and the clothes on their backs, Ida Mae and her husband were finally homeowners in Chicago. "It was beautiful," Ida Mae said years later. "Trees everywhere, all up and down the block." Weeks passed. Ida Mae went to work one morning and came back that evening on the streetcar over on Exchange. She walked down Colfax in the neighborhood of brick apartment buildings, barbershop storefronts, and frame bungalows along a route that she was just beginning to learn. It was then that she noticed something missing across the street from her 3-flat. A house had vanished. The people across from her had moved it, or so it appeared. There was now a small crater in the earth where just that morning a house used to be. It was a wonderment to Ida Mae and to James and Eleanor and the grandkids. Why would their nice white neighbors move their house clear off the street? Where did they go? What did this mean? They would never see them again to get the answers. They would never fully know for sure what had happened or why. It would become part of their family lore, one of the things they would tell over and over again, shaking their heads and hunching their shoulders as they looked out their second-floor window at the sociology unfolding beneath them. As it was, too much was happening anyway. Within weeks of the disappearing house, moving vans clogged Colfax Street. More people were vanishing, but those people left their houses behind. They took their sofas and upright pianos and were gone. "Lord, they move quick," Ida Mae said years later. "And then blacks started moving in. Oh, Lord. The whites left so fast, Ida Mae didn't get a chance to know any of them or their kids, or what they did for a living, or if they liked watching the Ed Sullivan Show like she did Sunday nights. They didn't stick around long enough to explain. But some of the whites who left the South Side in a panic would talk about it years later, and to tell the truth, never got over the loss of their old neighborhoods. "It happened slowly, and then all of a sudden, boom," said a white homemaker who fled Ida Mae's neighborhood around that time and was quoted by the writer Lewis Rosen, who had been a teenager when his parents fled South Shore in the book South Side. "Everyone was gone. Everything changed. Before you know it, this one, that one, and then you heard, so-and-so's moving." People didn't want to be the last.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. The number again is 760-569-7676, and the code is 769-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. For folks, if you don't want to use your phone, you can use the flash phone, or you can use any of the apps for the iPhone or smartphone. For the flash phone, the button should be on the Black Talk Network page, or you can put the URL in, which is tiny.cc/one-race. tiny.cc/one-race. And then just it'll open up a small window. On the first line, drop-down menu, select the number, which is 760-569-7676. On the second line, type in the code, which is 564943. And then on the final line, you can put in a fake name, you can put in a pseudonym, you can leave it blank. Just click the green button and it should connect you to the program. If you would like to participate, press *6 if you would like to participate, and then you'll get an audio prompt. Press the number 1 to put your hand up, and we'll get you on the line. We will hit the phone lines. I think Farmer Trav had a good addition as well. He got some extra information on one of the insurance companies in California. I'll get that in as well. The folks that dialed in so far, we should have SDI and Mr. Demery 4. Your lines should both be open.
Good evening. I'll chime in a minute. Background noise.
Oh, okay. No worries.
Yes, good evening. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, greetings, Gus, to the callers, listeners. We started, I guess, with the Clarks, Harvey Clark had searching for better housing for his family. Had moved into an area known as Cicero, Illinois, which it kind of reminded me that when I first moved to Chicago, the first job that I had was in Cicero, Illinois. And actually it was Western Electric, which is no longer there, but it was on Cermak and Cicero, in Cicero, Illinois. And I had heard stories about Cicero. I just didn't know how bad. Well, this mob had destroyed the apartment that the Clarks were moving into. The mob had grown. It was grandmas and housewives. When the kids would get out of school, then they would join until, I think the book said it was over 4,000 people there smashing up the apartment. What I thought was interesting was that the town officials didn't blame the mob for the riot, but rather the people who rented the apartment to the Clarks. And they even sent out some indictments, handed down some indictments against the rental agents and owners of the apartment building. One of the local, one of the famous columnists weighed in, called them bigoted idiots, which brings up, they always want to say that it's just this certain group of people that's acting that way, the idiots or the people that are ignorant. But as we know that white people are not ignorant of racism. The governor had called in the National Guard. They that the U.S. Attorney General, Kearney, was put on the prosecutor as a federal case, which I don't think anything ever happened about that whole thing. Anyway, the George Swanson story, I think that, he learned early that, fighting racism on an individual basis, from the position where you are, on the job. I was impressed with him because he would attack racism and any type of mistreatment of non-white people from his vantage point, by telling travelers their rights or helping people that were traveling that may not know about the areas that they were going into, would give them information. But it seems like that now up north, they all are beginning to realize that what they thought they was running away from was staring them straight in the face, right in the north. And it's starting to mention that Dr. King is in the picture. And it's getting really, on a mass scale to where it looks as though non-white people, blacks in particular, is tired of the mistreatment and are organizing and mounting up some type of counter-racist moves. I thought it was sad that Dr. Foster's brother had taken ill, and it looked as though he was misdiagnosed, because at first they thought it was his gallbladder, but it turned out to be a blood clot, if I'm not mistaken. It could have been that it was the gallbladder, and then the blood clot developed after the operation. Either case, he ended up losing his life, and I think that affected Dr. Foster, negatively for a long time after that. When he thought he, was giving his brother excellent care, it turned out that he had some part in his demise. I'll make one more statement. Item A, the so-called nice white neighbors that she wanted to get to know moved their entire house from the neighborhood. Not only, the whites started moving anyway when blacks would move into their particular area, but this particular neighbor moved the entire house. She said it was only a crater left. And I thought it was interesting that it said that the whites who left the South Side never got over the loss of their old neighborhoods. It's just like white people assuming that this is their country, this is their neighborhood, everything is theirs, and that they have some type of rights to it that no other group of people can share in any of the benefits. I'll mute my line and give someone else a chance to talk. Thanks. Taking my call.
Yeah. Great stuff. Yeah, I had a highlight for that particular point as well in Chicago with the Clark family, with that whole riot where no white people were that terrorist conduct, but also that they did not blame the Clark family. They blamed the individuals, and I was not sure. I thought it was white people. I was trying to go back to double check to make sure that was accurate, but they blamed the people who rented them the property to begin with. I said, this is your fault that you let these niggers get in here. I thought that was significant as well. I think white people, they understand. It almost, to me, is similar to the situation with President Obama. At least most white people, I think they understand white people are responsible for him being there. If white people didn't want them, or if certain white people, whoever got them that property, if they didn't want them to be there, they wouldn't be there. White people understand. That's why, going all the way back a couple of weeks ago, I was saying in New York when they were saying that the white people were caught off guard and they just didn't know what to do and they just got overran by these black people. I have a hard time believing that for the area of New York, because it seems like, and I think it's been said in the book over and over again, that white people controlled this. They just designated little areas that they were going to warehouse black people and make a lot of money off of it. I think we've heard that over and over again all across California, Chicago, New York. We're going to charge. Just pick whatever area we want to cram all these black people in and make this the new nigger section. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting point too with the Chicago situation with the Clark family. Esther, did you need a bit more time, or do you still have noise going on? Might still need a minute or two. You can feel free to chime in when you get situated. If you once you get yourself together and if you want to share anything. That I had. Number one, they mentioned how the North was seeming just like back south where they were running from. I think to Mr. Demery Ford's point about how they're slowly realizing that you cannot run from racism. They mentioned the murder in Neshoba County. They were talking about the 3 civil rights workers. I think that's Mississippi in 1964. I think from this point on, I think another caller had talked about this. I think from moving forward, when this incident comes up, I'm just going to name the black victim, James Earl Chaney, and 2 whites. That's the way I'm going to reference it from this point forward. I'm just going to name the black victim and then these other 2 white people that were killed, because I think the way that event gets talked about, the focus is on the white people. Like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe these young white guys got killed in all of this. And I've heard many, many people, white and black, point out that tons of black people were being terrorized and maimed in Mississippi and elsewhere, and nearly as much outrage as did the murder of these 2 white individuals who happened to be with James Earl Chaney. So moving forward, I'm just going to give his full name, James Earl Chaney, and 2 whites were killed in Neshoba County, 1964. The person that called in, I call in Alabama. Your line should be open as well.
Yes. I don't know, it's still something going on, like with your mic and everything. I don't know, I'm blaming white supremacists either way it goes. Either they tampering with it, or either they just made some bad products. But either way it goes, it's the white supremacist fault. But I like to say that when I was listening to about George and when he was in the train and letting the victims of racism know that they can keep their seat, he was like, it kind of reminded me of
a female caller you had, I think it was like a week ago, who was like, you know, she was trying to wonder, was she going to tell a coworker of hers about a Black Studies program. And, you know, the caution that was there, it kind of reminded me of the caution George had. George's caution reminded me of the victim of racism caution with her coworker. But, you know, and this is just how you have to be, you know what I'm saying? Like, you have to be cautious, and, you know, like he said, some of them he wouldn't, you know, say nothing to, you know, and sometimes he'll take a chance, and it'll be like, you know, the person just, you know, they didn't take it the way they probably should have, you know what I'm saying? They got loud, and like you said, it kind of reminded me sometimes of how I try to come and inform people about counter-racism, about the cows, about anything, you know, anything, like even just some black history authors or whatever like that, or lecturers or whatever the case may be. And it's like, anyway, you know, get on for me with that, you know, University of Alabama having a good year this year, though, ain't it? You know what I'm saying? And I'll be like, okay, you know. And I understand that, you know, they're victims, and I think that kind of helped me listening to this program and understanding that they were victims, and they were, not only were they conditioned, but their conditioning was conditioned, you know, and that kind of helped me mature as a person to hear all that type of stuff. And yeah, I mute my line. That's all I like to say.
That I think has been popping up over and over in the book. Black people, especially I think with George, him in Florida, working in the citrus grove, and then on the train trying to counter racism and the difficulty where black people, that fear, I think that's been another huge, I think, theme throughout the book. The fear that white terrorism installs in all of us, and how a lot of us, we're in denial, avoidance, just not wanting the horrors of racism, white supremacy, and just that passage is, I think, closer to the end there, just talking about what he would do on the train to try to let them know that they didn't have to give up their seat if they didn't want to, and how he tried to be so cautious about doing it and letting them know, hey, if you tell, I can be killed. If you go and tell the white people that I'm telling you this, like, man, I have high regard for Mr. Starling. Like, it just seems like he was consistently, even getting the money when the church in Georgia was bombed, and he went around and raised money and said he wanted to do what he could do. Like, you know, I think he even said money wasn't that big of a deal. Not that he had a lot of it, but just got to do something. They're bombing churches. This should be, you know, a sacred place, and racists are going out and terrorizing churches. Like, we got to do something. A lot of regard for Mr. Starling. Seems like he was just on the grind trying to do what he could to fight against racism at all times.
And that's why I really don't believe white people believe, like white Christians. I really absolutely don't believe that they believe in Christianity at all, because all those churches were burned by white Christians. You know, and I don't see how people don't even, I don't see how victims don't make that connection. You see what I'm saying? I mean, it's just absurd not to even make that connection, you know.
The religion of...
Oh, excuse me, go ahead.
Go ahead.
You know, I was like, church up the street for me, First African Baptist Church. I think, I forgot because I was a child when they were telling me this, but people that was my grandmother's age and stuff like that, they told me about either how that church was formed, called First African Baptist Church in Tuscaloosa. it was either bomb or either the fire department came and sprayed water hoses on them. It's like a lot of that went on. I'm talking about probably so much of that stuff, and I'm not even just saying back in those days. I'm talking about even now. I remember a church, I think it was probably like 30 miles from Tuscaloosa, 30 or 25 miles from Tuscaloosa. It was burned, and that was in 2008, 2009. And, you know, so white Christians, I don't know, that's why I just would not pray. I refuse to pray with white people. You know, I don't have to be the same religion with as a person, but I just refuse to pray with the white person.
Religion of white supremacy, I think, has been on display throughout the book. White people organizing and practicing their religion, which is not Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, or anything else other than the religion of white supremacy, white terrorism. That's what they do. I think it's been on display throughout this book in a variety of forms.
I'd like to say something about that. I think the fear tactics and the racist strategies that they use against non-white black people drive the non-white blacks to embrace Christianity as a means of escape or for some type of refuge. And I think that the racists know that. And so as you are embracing that and looking for some refuge, then they turn around and take that same refuge and blow it up or burn it to the ground to increase the fear factor. So now what are you going to do? The very thing that you thought you could run to, we just blew that up. Or you thought you had some type of protection inside of this sanctuary. Well, we just burned that down. So now what? So that element of fear is constantly there. And until, you know, as black people are collected, until we started to organize and to come up with counter-racist tactics, you know, actually, all we could do was to either cow down or to run from these tactics. But then we started to look forward to voting, to go into politics, hoping that we could find some relief there. But then again, we're met with the same thing. So I think it's all based upon that fear factor.
Absolutely. Even with Cicero, I thought that was a great point. Fear, which I think we should keep in mind. I think Doc said this last week, Dr. Welding, Dr. Kimbon, they talked about how we should be talking about that, how we are afraid of white people, where they said in Cicero, where they had the mobs and the Clark family, everything that they had to go through, them burning and destroying their property and everything else, that for years, on into the 90s, black people feared living in that neighborhood. I think they said it was like 1% black, and this is about 50 years after this incident happened, almost 50 years after this incident happened, where that generational fear is still there because of the white. That's deliberate. That's a part of the plan. And exactly what you said about churches. It's supposed to be your place of sanctuary and your place to go. And it was a hub of counter-racist activity for many, many years. You don't have any sanctuary. The book without sanctuary. That's what it's all about. White terrorism, lynching black folks without sanctuary. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. There was another quick point I wanted to get into. I'll mute my line in case S. and any of the other folks. We have about 10 minutes before we get to the second audio segment. I did catch a bit of the universalism again. The book is wonderful. It's not a gripe. It's just this could be a part of the editing once Miss Wilkerson wrote the text and then white people get their hands on it and change it around. It could have been that too. But she's talking about in Chicago, the white people would move out because they say, well, black people move in, it's going to drop the property value. And even if black people haven't moved in, just the thought or the notion that they could be moving in could affect property values and motivate white people to scamper. She said that at the same time, an urban turf war had risen up around them. Bombings, shootings, riots, or threats greeted the arrival of nearly every new colored family in white defended territory. The biggest standoffs came between the groups with the most in common, save race, the working class white immigrants and the working class black migrants, both with similar backgrounds and wanting the same thing, good jobs and a decent home for their families, but one group not wanting to be anywhere near the other and literally willing to fight to the death to keep the other out. I would say, in my view, it would not be accurate to call it a turf war because that kind of makes it seem like, even that kind of metaphor, that kind of makes it seem like these two sides have declared war on one another, and that's just not. According to the evidence even presented in this book, it was white people, regardless of whether they're new arrival white people or white people who migrated from the South, whatever the case may be, individuals who are classified, accepted as whites, warring on black people. You didn't, or at least I have not seen any evidence of black people saying, oh no, these white people are not moving in here, and terrorizing them when they tried to move into the neighborhood or open up a business in their neighborhood. I haven't seen any examples of that. I haven't heard one in the book that we've been reading thus far. And I think that's something we should be cautious about in making sure that that same unequal power dynamic, that white people who are warring against black people are being warred upon and responding to that war. And the level of violence, the warfare is not equal at all. It is white people waging war against us. Just something I wanted to reiterate. I'll mute my line. S. if you had anything, if you are able, or other folks.
That was an excellent point. I don't know if I said this, but the book pointed out Chicago found itself in the midst of a chronic urban guerrilla warfare. I said it was more like white terrorism rather than urban guerrilla warfare.
Speaking up on what y'all were talking about, fear tech, I was in a lunch line. I was in a subway today. Y'all don't mind if I go on with this, do it? Hello?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I was in a subway today, and I was getting a salad, and I'm speaking about fear. Y'all brought up fear, and that's what made me think of it. But I was waiting in line, and the officer, looked like a sheriff or some type of officer, came up, and he was standing like, and I could tell like I could read body language. He was standing with like some type of authoritarian type of stand, a power type of stand. Could just be me just misunderstanding. But when he was standing there, I was like, yeah, go ahead, you can pass. And he was just standing there. He was like, no, I'm waiting to get some food, which he was. But then I heard, for some reason it was like security call and subway. And even the subway folks started to trip on there, like security call and subway. And everybody started looking around, and folks were looking at me, and I'm looking like, I don't know. I'm just coming to get me some fuel it's a Saturday and gone by my business, you know. So, but let me get to my point. While the officer was standing there, and the officer did nothing wrong or nothing like that. It just, I've been getting pulled over by police and searched at least 10 to 14 times every year since I was around about 15 to 14 years old. So it's like I have some type of psychological type of thing where sirens, lights, all that in my mirror, it kind of makes me nervous, kind of like make me scared or whatever like that. And I felt an overwhelming type of fear when I did. I'm not doing nothing wrong. The officer ain't got nothing that he want to do to me or nothing like that. It just felt, I just felt this fear just overcome me. You know what I'm saying? And I mute my line, but see how talking about fear. I just wanted to share that. I mute my line.
I think it's probably important to note that Mayor Daley, when Dr. King came to Chicago, then Mayor Daley started a more refined type of racism, where he would meet with Dr. King and pretend that he was protecting the marchers, when in reality he was showing an overwhelming show of force by having even more officers there than there were marchers. I thought that was important because it signals a shift from the less refined tactics to a more refined strategy. And when Gunnar Murdoch wrote that almost everybody is against discrimination in general, but at the same time, almost everybody practices discrimination in his own personal affair. You know, it's a war, and the war is being fought with propaganda as well as strategic tactics that the racists are using. I just thought that I'd mention that. I'll mute my line.
Mr. Murdahl has been referenced on this program repeatedly. Lash's comments about his book and several other folks, many authors, I think a lot of people reference his text and have for many years, but that passage I thought was important. I just got a book. I try to pay attention to words. There's a text called The Tyranny of Words. Very interesting book. I feel like white people, the new age Timothy Wise, when he says you can be anti-racist and racist, I feel like Gunnar Murdahl in that passage where he says almost everybody is against discrimination in general, but at the same time almost everybody practices discrimination in his or her own personal affairs. Just that right there is how white people use words as a weapon, as a tool of white supremacy. You cannot say white people are against racism and then turn right around in the same sentence and say that white people practice racism. It would have to be stated better, like to be clearer, more accurate about what you're saying. If it's many white people publicly say or give the impression that they are not racist, but they are all practicing racism in a variety of ways. That would be much clearer so that we get an accurate understanding of what is being said. And I feel like white people do this all the time. Like, he does have great information, but in my view, that sort of statement where you're saying that, oh, see, these white people, they're against racism, but that right there is just the confusion. keep that pattern of not being as clear as you could be and how you talk about and describe the practice of racism, white supremacy. But I did think, and it continues because he goes from there where he says the way that they practice it in hiring and how they rent and blah, blah, blah. And he says it is the culmination of all these personal discriminations, he continued, which creates the color bar in the North. And for the Negro, wait a minute. Causes, my page got thrown off, sorry. For the Negro, causes unusually severe unemployment, crowded housing conditions, crime, and vice. About this social process, the ordinary white Northerner keeps subliminally ignorant and unconcerned. Now, even that is highly suspicious and profound. Subliminally ignorant and unconcerned. I would say he started, in my view, in being inaccurate. I would say probably deliberately not being clear with his word choice, and he ends the same way because we've got all of these pages before we get to this statement. Ordinary white Northerners in Cicero and these other areas doing everything that they could to keep niggas out of their neighborhoods, selling their property with the mere rumor that a Negro family might be coming to move in next to them, not hiring. I think we had last week where they said they were trying to hire black people in New York, and the white women said, oh, no, we don't want any niggas here. And this employer said, well, I can't hire them because the white people that are working here, my white employees don't want any niggas, so I can't hire them. They are hyper-conscious about this. To then come and say, well, they are subliminally ignorant and unconcerned, nothing truth. And that's another pattern that we've heard. I think Mr. Demerford said that they keep implying, suggesting that white people are ignorant. These are ignorant bigots. They're ignorant, they're uninformed, they're unaware. Nothing could be further from the truth. All of these books, there's one, The South Side, that was written, this came out in the 60s, where white people have studied. The study that I read from last week, The Negro in Chicago, is 800 pages. These white people are not ignorant. They're very aware. One nigga moves on the block and they all know and they all work like bulls. I'll end here. You cannot pick up a whole whopping house because one nigga say, oh, we're ignorant. We just didn't know. We were uninformed. Subliminally ignorant and unconcerned. Malarkey. Hogwash. Racism with words. I'll mute my line. If anybody gets 2 minutes to get a statement in, want to go ahead and start the second audio segment so we have ample time to discuss afterwards. Anybody got anything they want to get in and take 2 minutes or less?
Yeah, Gus, I'd like to ask one question. Yeah, the book said that Richard J. Daley, the mayor boss of Chicago, managed to outwit the civil rights leader, which was Dr. King, at nearly every turn. Do you consider that a true statement? I know Dr. King traveled with several lawyers, and I can't see Mayor Daley outwitting him at every turn. What do you think?
Based on my understanding of that period, and I think they have a whole Eyes on the Prize segment devoted to what Dr. King was doing in Chicago, and other folks have written and talked about that episode. My understanding of it, that is an accurate statement. Most people, when they talk about Chicago and Dr. King, they talk about it as though he took a loss in Chicago, and saying that he just was not prepared for the more refined tactics of racism, white supremacy in Chicago. I know there's one passage where he got hit with the rock, where when he said that there were whites in the trees protesting, shouting, everything else, throwing things, eggs and everything else, he seemed overwhelmed and unprepared for the racism that he observed in Chicago. I know how he moved his family into one of the slums in Chicago so that they could adjust to it, and talks about how it warped his children, how it was having a hugely detrimental impact on them, so much so that he ended up having to send his children back because it was so bad and it was impacting them so much just being in that environment. Pretty much all the sources that I've seen, it talks about it as though, yes, he took an L and white people got the better of him in Chicago. And even his self-admission that he just was not prepared for the levels of racism that he saw in Chicago. And I think that had a big impact on the depression that he was when I played the sound clip back in August of the March on Washington, where they were talking later when it was closer to when he was killed, 67, 68, him saying that he was depressed. And our sick white brothers, the quote from Dr. Cameron he references all the time, I don't know what we're going to do with our sick white brothers. I think his experience in Chicago had a lot to do with his evolving understanding of the depth of white pathology and their dedication to the religion of white supremacy. But I could be wrong, but according at least to the sources that I've seen, I would say, yeah, I think that's accurate. He took an L and that white people, Mayor Daley, they might have outsmarted Chicago.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. If anybody, if you didn't get to share, had something you wanted to get in, just write it down, keep a note. We should have ample time once the second audio segment concludes. If I have made an error, if folks have a different view on King's experiences in Chicago, we can get that in as well. We'll go ahead and get to the second audio clip, and once it concludes, we'll open up the lines and hear from everybody. Flip side, we should have a lot of time. Context of White Supremacy, Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, audio segment number 2.
A white father told Rosen, "I fought the good fight. I couldn't stay there with my 3 kids. My oldest was only 14 at the time. I made a judgment. I did the best I could." "It was like sitting around with a big group," said a white husband. "Okay, guys, in the next year, we're all going." "It was who found a house first," the wife chimed in. "Exactly, and we all went," the husband said. To the colored people left behind, none of it made any sense. "It was like having a tooth pulled for no reason," said a black resident who moved his family in, only to watch the white neighbors empty out. By the end of the year, the 7,500 block of Colfax and much of the rest of South Shore went from all white to nearly totally black, which in itself might have been a neutral development, except that many houses changed hands so rapidly it was unclear whether the new people could afford the mortgages, and the rest were abandoned to renters with no investment or incentive to keep the places up. The turnover was sudden and complete, and so destabilizing that it even extended to the stores on 75th Street, to the neighborhood schools, and to the street sweeping and police patrols that could have kept up the quality of life. It was as if the city lost interest when the white people left. The ice cream parlor closed, the Five and Dime shut down, the Walgreens on the corner became a liquor store. Karen and Kevin enrolled in Bradwell Elementary School and remember being, along with 2 other black kids, the only black children in the entire school in 1968. By the time they graduated 4 years later, the racial composition had completely reversed. Only 4 white children were left. South Shore would become as solidly black as the North Shore was solidly white. Ida Mae's neighborhood never had a chance to catch up with all the upheaval and was never the same again. South Shore was one of the last white strongholds on the South Side, the completion of a cycle that had begun when the migrants first arrived and started looking for a way out of the tenements. There were 58 bombings of houses that blacks moved into, or were about to move into, between 1917 and 1921 alone, bombings having become one of the preferred methods of intimidation in the North. In neighborhood after neighborhood, with the arrival of black residents, the response during the migration years was swift and predictable. It happened to ordinary people like Ida Mae and to celebrities like Mahalia Jackson, the leading gospel singer of her day. When she began looking for a house in a well-to-do section of the South Side, people held meetings up and down the block. A Catholic priest rallied his parishioners and told them not to sell to her. "You'd have thought the atomic bomb was coming instead of me," the singer said. She got calls in the middle of the night warning her, "You move into that house and we'll blow it up with dynamite. You're going to need more than your gospel songs and prayers to save you. She bought the house. It was a sprawling red brick ranch and the house of her dreams, coming as she had from the back country of Louisiana. A doctor had broken ranks and sold it to her. As soon as she moved in, the neighbors shot rifle bullets through her windows. The police were posted outside her house for close to a year. One by one, she said, they sold their houses and moved away. As fast as a house came on the market, a colored family would buy it. Even Hyde Park, an island of sophistication just north of Ida Mae's working-class neighborhood of South Shore, succumbed to the same fears and raw emotion that overtook the rest of the city's South Side. Shall we sacrifice our property for a third of its value and run like rats from a burning ship? Said a handbill circulated among white residents trying to keep blacks on the other side of State Street. Or shall we put up a united front to keep Hyde Park desirable for ourselves? Oddly enough, Hyde Park was one of the very few places where the alarmist rhetoric did not completely take. It was home to the venerable University of Chicago, which had its own interest in maintaining stability, and the neighborhood was blessed with some of the finest residential architecture in the city, giving many whites compelling and overriding reasons to stay. The neighborhood was one of the most expensive on the South Side, so blacks who moved there had to have the means just to get in. Thus, Hyde Park actually became a rare island of integration, despite the initial hostilities. Still, it was surrounded by all-black neighborhoods in a deeply divided city. Entire communities like the suburb of Cicero remained completely off-limits to blacks, and whites would avoid so much as driving through whole sections of the South and West Sides for the remainder of the century. By the time the migration reached its conclusion, sociologists would have a name for that kind of hardcore racial division. They would call it hypersegregation, a kind of separation of the races that was so total and complete that blacks and whites rarely intersected outside of work. The top 10 cities that would earn that designation after the 1980 census, the last census after the close of the Great Migration, which statistically ended in the 1970s, were, in order of severity of racial isolation from most segregated to least: 1. Chicago, 2. Detroit, 3. Cleveland, 4. Milwaukee, 5. Newark, 6. Gary, Indiana, 7. Philadelphia, 8. Los Angeles, 9. Baltimore, and 10. St. Louis, all of them receiving stations of the Great Migration. New York, late summer, 1967. George Swanson Starling. There came a time in the lives of many migrants' children when the parents sent them south for the summer to protect them from the uncaring streets of the Promised Land, or to learn the culture of their family of origin, or of the old country itself. It was a ritual practiced, more or less, by most families to ensure that their children knew where they came from. George and Inez Starling sent their daughter Sonia down to Eustis when she was 13. What happened there was the last thing they expected. She got pregnant. "It almost killed my wife," George said. It was devastating after all they had been through, and was the beginning of the most trying season of their lives. They had been married for 28 years. Theirs had not been a happy union, but at least they had a family and had made out okay in New York, almost in spite of themselves, because they were hard workers and deep down good and decent people. They had the highest hopes for their children, raised in a world free of the hardships they had endured in Florida. And now it was as if the South and the backbiting country town they had left had reached back and punished them for having had the nerve to leave. George had made a winless bargain. He had taken a job that kept him away from the very people he was working so hard to take care of, and he could not undo the damage already done. His absence only created a bigger gulf between him and Inez, and left the children without a father most of the time, and a mother with demons of her own to raise them practically by herself. When they learned of Sonia's pregnancy, George would not admit his pain. He reacted with resignation and had little sympathy for the despair Inez felt. Just as all those years before, She had had little sympathy for his earnestness in organizing the pickers in the citrus groves. The wounds they both carried had hardened and calcified, and the crisis over Sonia, what would become of her, what kind of future would she have, how would they manage to raise the baby, only widened the chasm. Each blamed the other and themselves. When he finally spoke, George's words cut deep. He said Sonia was no different from Inez. "It wasn't on account of your purity," he told her, with the barbed edge that seemed to characterize more and more of their interactions, "that it didn't happen to us. You can't deny it because you were doing it with me." Sonia gave birth to a baby boy she named Brian. It was 1968. She was 14. George, fatalistic now after all they had been through, said all he could do was laugh. The sins of the father were visiting the children. He thought back to when he was in the 10th grade and a girl in his class turned up pregnant. "She named me the father," he said. His first reaction was, how did she know that he was the father? That just about anybody could have been the father. His second reaction was that there went his future. For the rest of his life, he would be picking fruit during the citrus season and digging up palmetto roots the rest of the time, pretty much the only work around. "Let me finish the 11th grade," he remembered telling the grown folks. "I'd just like to finish out the 11th grade. I don't mind doing the right thing." The baby was born dead. "I was so relieved," George said. "I never tried to find out if it was mine." Now his daughter had come to him with the same news the girl he dallied with in high school had broken to her family all those years ago. "Now you know," he thought to himself. "Now you know how that mother felt when her daughter said she was pregnant by you." And so when the crisis over Sonia came up, George could only laugh through his tears at how much of what he had sown he appeared to be reaping. "I never did tell my wife," George said. "I didn't try to tell my wife why I was laughing. It was retribution." It was retribution on several fronts. At around the same time that Sonia got pregnant, so did another woman. It was a woman George had been going out with behind Inez's back. As their marriage strained under the weight of unspoken resentments, he gave in to temptation. It only made the unpleasant matters even worse, and life nearly unbearable for Inez, the discovery of 2 pregnancies she never would have imagined or wished for. The sadness and irony seemed to be turning in on itself, and it all seemed to point back to the rash and fateful day that George tried to get back at his father by marrying Inez in the first place. It appeared in the end he was only getting back at himself. The other woman gave birth to a son. The boy was named Kenny. He was born a few months after Sonia's baby was born. Kenny would grow up as an outside son, knowing his father George from afar and valuing him more than perhaps anyone else on earth, because he was in some ways more like his father than anyone else and loved what little he knew of him. Los Angeles, 1967. Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. Rufus Clement and his son-in-law, Robert Foster, were at opposite ends of the Great Migration. They represented the 2 roads that stood before the majority of black people at the start of the century. One man had stayed in the South. One had left it behind. Both had worked long and hard and had all the material comforts most any American could dream of. Yet both men wanted to prove to the other and to everyone else that his was the wiser choice, his life the more meaningful one. President Clement was the tight-buttoned scion of the Southern black bourgeoisie. Robert was a brilliant but tortured free spirit who had run from the very strictures Clement stood for. Clement was a distinguished accommodationist in the Jim Crow South, a beneficiary of it, in fact. He was not unlike the colored university president in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, whose allegiance was, above all, to the institution he ran, which had become an extension of himself. He was a pragmatist who had learned the fine art of extracting whatever he needed from guilt-ridden Northerners, or poorly credentialed but powerful segregationists, who wouldn't want him living next to them, but might grant him a concession or donate to his cause, the colored graduate school, Atlanta University. He was so vigilant as to his place in the colored hierarchy that he kept a card file near his desk, Time magazine reported, on every black person in the United States that he considered worthy of a high position in government and education, in case he got a query from Washington. Without trying, Rufus Clement had become an unwitting rival of Robert, not only for the affections of Robert's wife and children, but in both men's unspoken effort to prove that where each man had ended up was the better place for colored people. Robert had made out well as a noted surgeon in Los Angeles, but it did not rate with his father-in-law Rufus Clement, who had staked his claim in the South and prospered. President Clement had avoided the messy confrontations of the civil rights era, saying at one point that he had been disturbed, as any right-thinking Southerner might be, by the sit-ins, but recognized that this is the way in which they have tried to dramatize the way in which the American Negro has to live in his own country. He reassured white Southerners that we don't want to sit beside you. We just want to sit when we eat, like other people sit. We don't want to intermarry with your people. We simply want to get a drink of water where there is a drinking fountain available. His patient and deferential ambitions paid off in 1953, when against the longest of odds, he was elected to the Atlanta Board of Education, a first for a colored person there, while Robert, by contrast, was doing physicals and collecting urine samples for Golden State Insurance in what then seemed an unpromising start in California. The Clements hovered over Robert and pulled at his wife and daughters from afar. And as they did, Robert retreated further into the world of his patients, his bookies, and the B-list musicians he liked to hang around with. He was drinking more and coming in late. He had fallen hard for Vegas and now had discovered horse racing. He joined the club room at Santa Anita, since now he could well afford it, and liked to catch the trifectas at Hollywood Park Racetrack down in Inglewood. He would go to Vegas whenever the spirit hit him and could play long and well. "I don't need to eat and rarely need to go to the bathroom," Robert would say. "I can go 36 hours. He liked the Sands Hotel and the Las Vegas Hilton. He went so often and bet so much that the hotels started comping him rooms and meals. Some trips he brought back tens of thousands of dollars. Some trips he lost that much, but he was hooked. While he was out betting heavy and looking for something that did not exist and that nobody could give him, Alice set about establishing herself as a proper surgeon's wife. She joined the Links and the Auxiliary of Doctors' Wives and hosted teas and bridge parties for the same kind of social set she had grown accustomed to back in Atlanta. The girls took piano and voice lessons and came out at their cotillions in white princess gowns. They were living parallel lives, and Alice and the girls tried not to notice that Robert, whose long hours helped finance their ball gowns and socials, was trying to fill some hole that could not be filled and was hardly ever around. At one point, Alice had had enough. She packed up the girls and moved back to Atlanta with the Clements, who surely had not approved of how their daughter and granddaughters were faring with Robert. Somehow Alice and Robert made up, and she came back to Los Angeles. But nothing really had changed. They had both come into their own and seemed less suited in some ways than before. Perhaps they had always been ill-suited for each other, but were just beginning to realize it, now that they had a life and a family and reputations to protect. They reached a kind of understanding and came together on the shining occasions when their mutual love of hosting and socializing happened to intersect at the grand parties they threw and the costumes they wore. It was a ritual, and they had an understanding. Robert dressed Alice. Robert bought the clothes. Robert chose the clothes. Dressing Alice was his personal project. He studied her as a surveyor would study an isthmus, knew her assets and liabilities as far as tailoring went, and accompanied her not so much as an advocate for her tastes, but as a guardian of his own reputation. When Alice started moving up in the Links and had more cotillions to go to, He was happy for her and wanted her to look good, but it was a defensive kind of happiness. He wanted Alice to outdress the other women. "I didn't want those women to say my wife had anything less than the best," Robert said. In the early days, he would prep her before a big formal. "You got to go out there first, baby," he would tell her. "You represent me." Every entrance was a production. They would approach the doorway of a ballroom. Robert would adjust himself and pause to let his wife go before him. "I'd walk 2 paces to the right and the rear and just watch her make that entrance," he said. And she could walk. Before every big occasion, the ritual was the same. The two heading to the store's back room, the sales clerk bringing in dresses that Robert knew were all wrong for Alice, and Robert saying, "Pick what you like." Alice would try on a dress. Robert inspected her and directed her movements. "Walk," he told her, and she would begin. "Come to me." She moved toward him. "Sit." She would find an ottoman and position herself. "Stand." She lifted herself up. "Turn." And she would do so. "If the dress didn't talk to me, it wasn't her dress," he said. "The salespeople go crazy. Who is this man? Who is he?" Over time, he began to sort the big moments of his life by whatever Alice was wearing. It seemed as if he remembered the gown if he remembered nothing else. Those gowns got people talking, and it was exactly what he wanted to hear. "Foster, you dress your women well." "I couldn't be betting $100 on a horse and skimping on my wife," he told me many years later. "I know I'm bragging, and I'm enjoying it." Sometimes the Clements would come out to visit them in Los Angeles, and Robert would put on his most charming performance to prove how well he had made out in the Promised Land. He invited the colored men of importance in the city to meet with his father-in-law and alerted the Los Angeles Sentinel so that the visit could be captured for posterity, as the Clements would have expected. The two men would never be close, but Robert knew how to put on a show when he had to. By 1966, President Clement had risen to such a level of esteem at Atlanta University that a building was named in his honor. Clement Hall, an august red-brick classroom building on the campus promenade, had its formal dedication on October 16, 1966. Alice and Robert's youngest daughter, Joy, in bangs and a white headband, cut the ribbon with her grandfather right behind her. Alice stood watching in a pillbox hat and tailored dark suit and corsage. Bunny was there in a tweed, peacoat, and gloves, with her Jackie Kennedy in the White House bob and beautifully chiseled 60s cover-girl face in a show of support for her grandfather. Robert did not attend. The man who had managed to oust W.E.B. Du Bois from Atlanta University by lobbying the university's Board of Trustees all those years ago was in New York in early November 1967 for the regular meeting of that same Board of Trustees. On the afternoon of Tuesday, November 7th, during a break in the board's proceedings, Clement collapsed in his suite at the Roosevelt Hotel. He died of an apparent heart attack. He was 67 years old. He and his wife Pearl had planned to embark on a round-the-world tour after the board meeting. Instead, plans for interment were made. Pearl would have to move out of the president's mansion at Atlanta University, which had been her home and decorated to her liking for most of her adult life. She would have to move in with her next of kin, her beloved only daughter Alice, in Los Angeles. Robert would have a wing with a bedroom and sitting area built for his mother-in-law and would try to make the best of it. News reports of Rufus Clement's death appeared in the Atlanta Daily World, the New York Amsterdam News, the Los Angeles Sentinel, and elsewhere. The New York Amsterdam News wrote that, in addition to his widow, he is survived by a daughter, Mrs. Robert Foster of Los Angeles. Robert himself went unmentioned. Chicago, February 1968. Ida Mae Brandon Gladney. A police wagon pulled up to a West Side hospital over at Division and Kedzie amid a rabble of placard-waving protesters on strike against the hospital, Walther Memorial. The strikers marched at the entrance in the biting cold. They were picketing for higher wages for the orderlies and nurses' aides who did the kinds of things nobody notices until they go undone. Inside the police wagon, bundled up with coats and purses, looking wide-eyed at the people protesting in circles along the sidewalk, were Ida May and her co-worker and friend Doris McMurray. For several weeks in February 1968, that was how Ida May went to work each day. Ida May respected the strikers, knew them by name, had worked right beside them, and got along with most of them, but she wasn't going to stand out there and strike with them. She had been working since she was big enough to get behind a plow. She had had all kinds of back-breaking, mind-numbing, sometimes dangerous, and usually thankless jobs, and had finally come into a position as a hospital aide. She had gotten the job in 1949 after more than a decade of scuffling from domestic to steelworker to press operator. She had finally come into a job she liked and that suited her temperament. She had come a long way from the cotton fields in Mississippi for the chance to work indoors with people rather than outdoors with crops, and to get paid for the job and feel some dignity doing it. She had never stood up to a boss, or refused to work, or tried to petition for more money, even though she surely could have used it, and more than likely deserved it. She had faith that whatever she needed would eventually come to her. The concept of not working a job one had agreed to do was alien to Ida May. So when her union local announced it was going on strike at the beginning of 1968, Ida May and her friend Doris never considered that they would stop going to work. Decades earlier, colored migrants unaccustomed to unions and not understanding labor politics had been brought in by northern industrialists specifically to break up strikes. White union members resented the migrants and beat them for breaching the picket lines they had unwittingly been brought in to cross. Ida May was not schooled in the protocols of union organizing, but she knew she couldn't afford to lose her job and couldn't see how not working was going to help her keep it. She was under more pressure than ever. She and George had just bought their first house, the 3-flat in South Shore, and had new and different bills coming at them than ever before, from the mortgage to the utilities to property taxes and hazard insurance. My pastor was just begging me, Ida May remembered. Please don't cross that picket line. Her children were worried for her. They didn't want me to go, Ida May said, but I wasn't studying them. George was his usual contained self. If he was scared for her, he didn't let on. The idea of not going to work was as foreign to him as it was to Ida May. I don't reckon he ever knowed no different, Ida May said. She made no apology for doing what she felt was living up to her responsibilities. Even the union boss teased her and said he knew why Ida May couldn't strike. She can't stay off, he said. She got to pay for that 3-flat building. She got to pay that house note. You right, Ida May said. When Ida May and Doris told management they were going to keep working, the hospital arranged for a driver to pick them up at a designated location and escort them into the building. One day, the strikers beat up the hospital driver after he had dropped the women off, and for the first time, Ida May realized the seriousness of this thing. Then the hospital came up with another way to get Ida May and Doris to work. It arranged for a police wagon to pick up the 2 women at a designated bus stop. It was just like we were going to jail, Ida May said. They would climb out of the police wagon at the entrance to the hospital, and the police would walk them past the pickets into the building. Scabs, some of the picketers, shivering on the cold sidewalk, would yell at Ida May and Doris. You a scab, Ida May would shoot back, not knowing the labor union meaning of the word, but hurling it anyway, because to her, everybody should have been working. Ida May couldn't let a heckler go unanswered, and it frightened Doris. Shut up, Ida, Doris whispered. Ida, hush. The two of them were working on the 6th floor in surgery, and on their breaks could look out the window and see the pickets below. After so many hours outside, the strikers had to find ways to protect themselves from the freezing wind. They would scurry to their cars and sit for a while, and they would use buckets instead of the toilet in the building, because the hospital wouldn't let them in. The strikers never threw anything but names at Ida Mae and Doris, and when the two of them looked back on it years later, they marveled that they had never gotten hurt. "I wouldn't do that now," Doris said. Ida Mae turned to Doris. "Well, I didn't really understand," Ida Mae said. "We all supposed to be working. Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and Memphis, April 1968. The evening was unusually cool for Memphis in April. It was shortly before 6 o'clock, and Martin Luther King Jr. was heading to dinner before attending a rally for striking sanitation workers. He was standing on the 2nd-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel on Mulberry Street, just outside his room, room 306. A half-dozen of his aides were with him, gathering themselves to leave. Someone reminded King of how chilly it was getting. He agreed and went to get his topcoat. At the precise moment that he turned back to his room, a minute past 6 on April 4th, 1968, a single .30-caliber bullet was fired into the balcony. The rifle shot, thought to have come from a flophouse across the street through the bare branches of the mimosa trees, struck him in the neck and severed his spinal cord. King was pronounced dead at St. Joseph's Hospital at 7:05 p.m. Central Time. Within hours, the poor, colored sections of more than 100 cities went up in flames. That night, George Starling was rounding the corner at 131st Street and St. Nicholas Avenue in Harlem. He was returning home from a night out with the guys and saw the fires rising up ahead. He was trying to get to 132nd and Lenox, not yet knowing what had happened to set the people off. The whole thing was a blur, and he was looking for a way to get around the mayhem. "It was in the direction of St. Nicholas Avenue," he said. "It could have been on Broadway, St. Nicholas, or Amsterdam. It was up on that hill. They were burning everything up there. The sky was lit up like it was the end of time." He made his way home, and it was only when I got into the house and turned on the radio that I heard the news that Martin Luther King had been shot in Memphis. The evening of the assassination, Ida Mae would cup her face in disbelief at the news playing out in a scratchy, continuous, incomprehensible loop on the AM radio dial and the family's black-and-white television set. She would pray for the soul of the man she so admired and had once almost seen during his Chicago campaign 2 years before, as he had tried to free the people who had fled to the north. On the other side of town, over on the west side, police sirens wailed and rocks crashed through the plate-glass windows of grocers and liquor stores. Whole blocks went up in smoke in Chicago, and on the streets of Newark, Detroit, Boston, Kansas City, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and elsewhere. The receiving stations of the Great Migration would burn all through the night after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And when it was over, some neighborhoods, the old places the migrants had packed into when the migration began, would look like Berlin after an airstrike during the Second World War. The dispossessed children of the Great Migration, but more notably, the lifelong black Northerners broken by the big cities, let out a fury that made a mockery of the free harbor the North was reputed to be. A presidential commission examining the disturbances found that more black Northerners had been involved in the rioting than the people of the Great Migration, as had mistakenly been assumed. About 74% of the rioters were brought up in the North, wrote the authors of what would become known as the Kerner Report. The typical rioter was a teenager or young adult, a lifelong resident of the city in which he rioted. What the frustrated Northerners appeared to be seeking was fuller participation in the social order and the material benefits enjoyed by the majority of American citizens, the commission found. The discontent of the young people unsettled the migrant parents who had fled the violence of the South. They could do little to dissuade their children from whatever role they might play in the outburst. It was too late to try to get them jobs at now-closed factories, or the education they missed if they gave up on school, or maybe most of all, the grounding and strength they themselves had acquired after having endured so much. The parents had come from the old country, had been happy to have made it out alive, and made a few dollars an hour. What did they know of the frustration of the young people who had grown up in the mirage of equality, but a whole different reality, in a densely packed world of drugs and gangs and disorder, with promises that seemed to have turned to dust? Ida May saw the destruction on the news, and as usual tried not to worry about things she could not control. George Starling managed to negotiate his way through the burning streets of Harlem. They had long since left the South, where Dr. King had been killed, and yet they were pulled into the aftermath. In the North, the migrants grieved for the man who had worked miracles in the land of their birth, and thus for them from afar. It was Thursday, a work day, and across the country, Robert Foster, workaholic that he was, would have been in his office attending his usual overflow of patients at what would have been late afternoon on the West Coast. His office on Jefferson and his house in West Adams were comfortably situated far from Watts, where the fires had burned 3 years before. Ever conscious of appearances and propriety, he would be nearly as incensed at the violence as he was stunned at the assassination. To him, spite never settled anything. It only gave your detractors more ammunition, and as it had back when the colored people in Monroe had urinated in the colored section of the Paramount Theater, only ended up hurting the people themselves. To Robert, the whole world had just about gone mad. A few years before King's death, Robert had been beside himself when he learned that Bunny, a student at Spelman College in Atlanta, caught up in the zeitgeist of the moment, was talking about maybe picketing too, as only a bourgeois daughter of the upper class would. It would not be trying to register poor people to vote in the backwoods of Mississippi, that was out of the question, but by, say, protesting Rich's department store in downtown Atlanta with a white-gloved delegation of other colored college girls. On this, Rufus Clement and Robert agreed. Bunny simply could not be seen being arrested with a riffraff, all because Rich wouldn't let colored girls try on hats. Of course, Robert understood the indignity, had lived it after all, which is why he had raised her in Los Angeles and taken her to Beverly Hills for whatever she and Alice and the other girls might ever think they wanted. It wasn't that he was against the civil rights movement. He was all for standing up for one's rights. It was just that to his way of thinking, the way to change things was to be better than anybody at whatever you did, wear them down with your brilliance, and enjoy the heck out of doing it. So he had no patience for these sit-in displays, at least for his daughters anyway, much less actual violence. The day King died was a dark day all around. It was around midnight that George encountered the destruction in Harlem. It wasn't all the people out in the streets that got his attention. It wasn't unusual for a lot of people to be out on the streets of Harlem if it were the least bit warm. What caught his eye were the flames. That Thursday evening in April, George had been hanging out with the guys over on Prospect Avenue. He was talking baseball and downing Boilermakers, a shot of Smirnoffs with orange juice, and a chaser of beer. He was trying to escape the disappointments of an underutilized mind, and a sand trap of a marriage he was too loyal and upright to leave. The men were so distracted by the vodka and the joshing over the Yankees and the Mets and the Dodgers, who had years before left Brooklyn for Los Angeles, and over the baseball season that was to begin the very next week, that they failed to register the assassination of one of the most influential figures in American history. It was only when George finally made it into his car and back into Harlem that he realized that something terrible had happened. The sky lit up, he remembered. When I turned into 131st Street, as soon as I looked, I saw the whole sky is on fire. George Starling knew what it meant to stare an enemy down in a life-and-death sort of way, and had respect for Dr. King. But by the time King was assassinated, George was unable to marshal much emotion. He had grown up with that kind of violence against people fighting the system and half expected it. No, what had really shaken him was the assassination 5 years earlier of John F. Kennedy, the president so many blacks had placed their hopes in, Kennedy having come from the North and from what they saw as a more enlightened generation than previous presidents. George was in Florida in November 1963. I used to go down every October or November. I had just passed through Ocala on the way to Gainesville, and it was in the afternoon, George remembered. And I turned the radio on and I heard them say, "And the President of the United States has been assassinated. He was shot, and he did not survive," or something like that. And I said, "Now what kind of joke is that?" And then it came back on. You know they wouldn't have risked repeating it over and over. And when I realized that Kennedy had really been killed, assassinated, that thing hit me. When I knew anything, I'd run off the road. I don't know what I was doing. And it just so happened that the shoulder was grassy. It wasn't that much traffic. It was in the mid-afternoon, and I just brought the car to a stop, and I just sat there, and I cried like a baby. For some reason, it was different with King than with Kennedy. Perhaps the losses were piling up, and George couldn't muster the same shock and pain anymore. "I didn't cry," he said. "I was just astonished. I was just numb. I couldn't believe it. Then I thought about his speech. He predicted his own death whether he knew it or not. He told it. I've been to the top of the mountain and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not make it there with you, but you will get to the promised land." James Earl Ray, a 40-year-old drifter and prison escapee, would be convicted of the murder. Ray left a trail of evidence that he had been stalking King for months, but until his own death in 1998 left questions as to what role he had actually played in the assassination. Ray was not from the South, as the migrants who left it might have expected. He was from Alton, Illinois. Precisely a week after King's death, and 2 years after King's brokered and dispiriting effort to end housing segregation in Chicago, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act of 1968, banning discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin in the renting or selling of property. King's bruising fight for the people in the North would not be won until King had died.
The number to dial, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. Got more than 30 minutes. The number again, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. All the folks that dialed in, your line should be open. I will get other hands as I see them. The only comment I will make briefly, man, it's looking so long. I have so many notes. The only comment I will make briefly when this is George Starling in New York. He's talking about the King assassination, Dr. King, when he says he's hanging out with the other guys, they're drinking and everything. He says they're drinking, they're smeared off with orange juice and trying to escape the disappointments of an underutilized mind and a sand trap of a marriage. I think we had talked about this book being disappointing, that sentence. Wow. The disappointments of an underutilized mind. I think many, many black people, 2013, can definitely relate to that, unfortunately. Let's see, Mr. Demery 4, S. Dot, caller in Alabama. Your lines are all open.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. First, we were talking about religion, the religion of white supremacy. When a Catholic priest rallies his parishioners and told them not to sell to Mahalia Jackson, who was a gospel singer. Now that's a prime example of the religion of white supremacy. It outweighs Christianity. They have to practice white supremacy. George and Inez's daughter got pregnant at 14. Their son, Gerard, was battling drugs. His marriage was suffering, like you just said. But yet and still, all this dysfunction that was in George's family, in his mind, he felt it was retribution for something he had done earlier in his life. He was blaming himself. He had a couple of kids outside his marriage. But, you know, when he go back into his mind, he would always think about what he felt about his father and how he married Inez just to spite his father. The sadness and irony seemed to be turning in on itself. Dr. Foster's father-in-law, I thought it was interesting. You know, he was quite a character, president of Historical Black College, and he was a pragmatist that had learned the fine art of extracting whatever he needed from guilt-ridden Northerners or poorly credentialed but powerful segregationists who wouldn't want to live next to them but might grant him the concession or donate to his cause. You know, I thought about that, and you know, if you think about it, you know, making a compensatory request, you know, by whatever means that he had to get those funds to keep the colleges running. You know, I guess it would serve the greater good. But he certainly wasn't on the front battle lines fighting racism. But Dr. Foster, you know, the book seems to insinuate that after his brother's death, then Dr. Foster, some people turned to alcohol, drugs. It looks like Dr. Foster turned to gambling. I don't know many people that can gamble 36 hours straight without eating. Lose tens of thousands of dollars, and sometimes he'd make it, sometimes he'd lose it. That's probably going to go on for quite some time. I think that's one of his loves, really. I think he loved gambling as much as he did the medical field. Looks like he liked dressing his wife, but it was saying that he knew her assets and liabilities as far as tailoring went, but it wasn't so much as advocating for her taste as it was guardian of his own reputation. So she was, I guess you might say, she was a trophy wife. And he liked showing off, buying expensive clothes for her. And then his father-in-law passed away. I thought, well, Dr. Foster didn't go. Let's see. I don't think he went to the funeral. But at first I was thinking, it's sad that in the obituary, in the newspaper, they mentioned that Professor Clement was survived by a wife and a daughter, Mrs. Robert Foster, but they didn't mention Dr. Foster. But if he didn't go to the funeral, I guess that they never got along. The president and Dr. Percy Foster never got along. And so, in his death, now the mother-in-law has got to come and live with him and his wife. That's going to be a colorful sight, because you know that she probably don't feel too much love for Dr. Foster herself. I thought it was interesting also that white people would give the colored migrants jobs to break the strikes, but they would put them, and at the same time the white union members would resent that and beat them up. So you got white people using you, giving you a job, and then white people beating you up for taking the job. And probably a lot of the migrants didn't even understand the complexities of union organizing, and nobody bothered to take the time to explain it to them. Poor Ida Mae, they was figuring out ingenious ways to get her and a co-worker to work. You know, when you become a scab, you kind of take your life, you put your life on the line, because those people will kill you when you're breaking a line, a strike line. I'll give someone else a chance to talk. Thank
you. Other folks on the line have anything they wanted to share? S. Caller in Alabama. Anybody else that has not shared on the line wants to speak? *6, number again 760-569-7676, code 564-943#. Press *6 if you have any comments on the book, Warmth of Other Suns.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was I was kind of like tripping out about how they said how they tried to make attempts on Mahalia Jackson's life, and then they told her that the gospel won't save her, and you know, that's kind of, again, like with Dr. King, you know, regardless of, I think Mr. Ford, I think that's his name, Mr. Ford, the caller. He said that a lot of black victims of racism seek refuge in Christianity, and the supremacists, white supremacists, show them over and over again that, you know, there's not safety. Like, they killed Dr. King, and it just I'm not gonna say it shocks me, because it really don't, but I just, like you said, tacky, trashy, and terroristic, and that's about all I like to say. And other than the point where George, I believe, who was riding on Linux with the Reverend Dr. King, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and showing that it was like there was people of color were burning down their own communities. It kind of reminded me of what Neely Fuller was saying, that white people were ready for them to come into their neighborhood and burn down their neighborhood because they would have killed them. And it kind of reminded me of what the Asians did in Los Angeles by killing the blacks, or shooting at least black people who were coming, just out of anger and confusion, knowing not what to do. So, kind of reminding me, this book is kind of reminding me, rioting is probably the least constructive thing I could ever do to act out about my anger about white supremacy. And I mute my line.
Ashe. No fan of the rioting. Generally does not work out to the benefit of black people. I thought it was pretty interesting. I think it was George Starling, when he was talking about his response to the King assassination and the Kennedy assassination. We're coming up on the 50-year anniversary of the assassination of JFK, and white people are starting to focus attention on that. That's 1963. It was quite a year with regards to racism, white supremacy, and other things, but they just had a really interesting piece. I'll be planning on the compensatory call-in Saturday. They had this segment talking about the white people in Dallas during '63 and how it very similar to what you see right now, just rabid racists. They just call them right-wingers, far-right extremists, GOP, same folks right now that are doing the shutdown and fussing with President Obama. But I said during that time, you had white people when Kennedy was killed who were coming out and saying publicly, good, got what he deserved. I'm glad he died. Got these niggas around here running around asking voting and all this other stuff. Like, you had a lot of white people who were upset with Kennedy because they felt like he was too soft on the nigger question in their mind. And I asked Mr. Fuller about that. I would encourage listeners, if you have parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, older black, even if you just know them, they're friends or what have you, ask them what they were doing when Kennedy was killed in '63, what they thought. You can get some interesting feedback. I asked Mr. Fuller about it. He had quite a response as well. But I'm not surprised. That's even in Oliver Stone's film about JFK, where there's a black maid. There's a black maid. She's working for the district attorney, Jim Garrison, and she's she's crying and just totally shook up when they find out that JFK's been assassinated. When Martin Luther King is killed, it's just, oh my gosh. It doesn't have that same sense of overwhelming grief and emotion and sorrow. It's just real interesting hearing that whole response and thinking that President Kennedy had some regard for black people, or that I think he thought this was a younger generation of white people and he didn't have the same racist angst as a lot of the as well as his comments at saying that he was just numb. Kennedy being assassinated in '63, Dr. King being assassinated in '68, that he had just been numb to all of the death and terrorism and beatings, that he said he almost expected that to happen with Dr. King, as did a lot of people, that, this was going to happen. He's going to die. being out here and being so public and vocal, fighting against racism, white supremacy. And I guess even for George, him saying, hey, this almost happened to me. I had to flee Florida to save my life, and I had to, switch train routes to keep it from happening again, fighting against racism. So I thought that was pretty interesting too.
Yeah, on most pictures, I ain't gonna say on most, but a lot of households I've seen of victims of racism. You have the white Jesus, JFK, and Dr. King. That's the whole trio. Not saying nothing bad about it, but that's what it is. A lot of times they held them in very high esteem, And I guess to be reasonable, I would look at it as the way they were looking at it. Probably, I can't speak for that generation, but what makes sense to me is they looked at it. Well, a covert racist is better than a violent, blatant racist, But I don't know. I know one thing. I don't think even the people that did have JFK in their house and stuff, behind closed doors, they were always suspect of white people, and because those were the people that raised me. And, they always taught me to be suspect of whites. I remember, I'm ready for the cowbell, but I remember in high school, I used to talk to a little white girl, and they made it clear. My family made it clear. Don't bring no white girl around us. You know what I'm saying? The same family members now, the same family members who I say now are confused, they seem to have a clear understanding of racism more than I did back then. So I have to question my level of confusion I think they have. You know what I'm saying? But I mute my line.
I can comment a little on that. I remember I got a remarkable memory, but I can remember being in the third grade when President Kennedy was killed. And I can remember it pretty vividly because the teacher was crying and all of the students were crying. And I can remember feeling like that this has got to be the end of the world. And it's just the fear that we felt because during that particular time they were teaching school kids. Well, we had the fear of Russia, the Cold War, and the fear of nuclear attack and Khrushchev, and they would teach us to get underneath our chairs. What good is that going to do in a nuclear attack to get up under your desk? But I can remember when he was killed, and I can also remember Dr. King's assassination and all the rioting, afterwards. It seemed like black people were, we thought I say we, I was looking at it on television, but, it was just an expression of the frustration and, we were just angry, and we had to take it out some type of way. It's just unfortunate that it was just in our own neighborhood, because Watts, all the major cities were up in flames, and it just was not a good time. But back to the book, I thought that when they were talking about the rioting, each one of the protagonists had a different view of the assassination. Dr. King's assassination. You know, Ida Mae and Dr. Foster, the way he looked at it, I don't know how he came up with comparing it to when people were urinating in the theater. But, you know, I don't know if, well, you can't say whether it was correct or not, but they each felt their own sense of grief or, you know, expression of remorse. It was just a terrible time. And it's kind of a point in your life where, you know, like Gus was saying, you can ask people what were they doing when these things happen, and you'll get different responses, and a lot of people probably can't remember too vividly, you know, the emotions that they were feeling at that time, but I guarantee you fear was one of them. I'll mute my line.
I thought with Dr. Foster, his comparison to urinating in the stairwell at the theater, I thought that was talking about the people who were rioting and tearing up their own neighborhoods. I thought that was the parallel he was making, not Dr. King, what he was doing, just the way that they responded to his murder.
Yeah, I think you're correct, because it was talking about his office was comfortably situated far away from Watts, where the fires was burning. But he was conscious of appearance and propriety. And he didn't like violence. But he was incensed at the violence as well as stunned by the assassination. To him, it only gave your distractors more ammunition. Yeah, I guess he was talking about the rioting and acting up in your own neighborhoods. It didn't really accomplish anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's for sure. And what about the story Mr. Neely Fuller talked about when the guy set fire on the liquor store and it burned down his grandmother's house?
Mm-hmm.
He really felt bad about that.
Yep. I think that was in response to the King, Dr. King's assassination. I think that's one of the incidents that he frequently references when he's talking about the futility of rioting in response to racism. I also want to make sure I got in before we close. I think we've said repeatedly, this book, very depressing, many of the aspects that are in it, but I think you can learn a lot from it because it's so detailed. This was not a good week for Black love, this week's segment. Anyway, through it, I think not so much with Ida Mae and George this week, but definitely with George and Inez in New York, and Dr. Robert Pershing Foster and Alice in California. Not the best display of Black love. And in my view, this is what's likely to happen under the system of racism, white supremacy, where it's just not going to get where you want it to be. It doesn't have to be as bad as it got, with these examples, but pitiful illustrations of what white people have planned. This is what they know is likely to happen as long as the system of white supremacy exists. I thought it was one of the more disturbing aspects, the scene when Dr. Pershing was taking his wife out to get clothes, and this ritual that they would go through, sit, stand, twirl. I mean, it was almost like you're on an auction block with a slave of some sort, or training, training a pet or something, going through this ritual. It just seemed very devoid of any sort of loving humanity and what you would expect between a husband and a wife. Just, this is all just for my reputation, all just show off. I think we talked about that a lot throughout this book as well, showing off and trying to do things to compensate for being terrorized, victims of racism, white supremacy. But that, I thought, was pretty bad. Obviously, the whole situation, the stress and strain that George and Inez were dealing with, and all of that, I think it was referenced going back, this whole marriage not coming out of any genuine affection or care between the two of them, but George trying to get back at his dad for not paying his tuition at school. But the line that, I mean, really, black love, when I say black love, sounds about as bad as white. When George is talking about in high school, when he was in the 11th grade, and he was suspected of being the father of this young black girl's child, and it turns out that the child was stillborn. And he says, the baby was born dead. I was so relieved, George said. I never tried to find out if it was mine. That sentence, and just the whole way that they talk about this pregnancy and another black life coming into being, it reminded me when we had Shafia Monroe on the program. She's the president, International Center for Traditional Childbearing. No one being pleased about black life, more trauma, another reason to be angry with a black person. Either you cheated, or this, you're a teen mom, teenage pregnancies, just added strife, added strain. Having even I think with Ida Mae, when she was pregnant and didn't tell her husband, didn't tell George, and she had her reasons for that. It's not a criticism, but just it seems like that's been a pattern as well. When there's a black pregnancy, a black life, it is not a joyous occasion. It's not a celebration. It's not hoorah, that sort of thing. It tends to be, oh man, oh gosh, another strain, another burden, and even in this case with George, where he was relieved that the child died. Not the best illustrations of black love this week. Any final thoughts before we wrap the program up? Anything else folks want to get in?
I had one question I'd like to pose to you and the caller from Alabama. If either one of you thought that with Dr. Foster being the way that he was, the jitterbug doctor, he liked to gamble, he was a sharp dresser, he made a lot of money, and the fact that Ray Charles wrote a song about him stealing his woman. It just sounds to me like Dr. Foster may have been a player also. But the book doesn't mention any infidelity in his marriage, but just seems to me he fits the mold of a player. What do you think, Gus?
Which person? You said Dr. Foster?
Yes.
When you say, what do you mean when you say fits the role of a player?
Well, he seems like the type of guy that would probably have, like the book said, he liked to dress his women. Foster, you dress your women well. And the song about him, with Ray Charles say running off with his woman. I'm just wondering if Dr. Foster could not have been a womanizer himself. What do you think?
I think in this week's section of the book, I think his wife went back to Georgia for a little while when they were having some difficulties. And it seemed like they had a certain amount of strain on their marriage anyway, and he spent a lot of time in, I mean, I think Vegas being internationally known as Vice City, and they got legalized prostitution, and that's kind of the whole idea. Go to Vegas and do as much dirt as you can. It would not surprise me, particularly if you're making money, you're a doctor, you dress well. That's a whole part of his appeal, and what he's trying to do with his practice is to dress nicely and have the big flashy Cadillac and all that. It would not surprise me, particularly with when he first gets out there, his wife wasn't there. It took her a while to even get there, and then she gets there and they have a lot of stress and strain. Then she leaves for a while. They still have a lot of stress and strife in their relationship, and he has these long, crazy hours as a doctor, and then he's spending 36 hours at the casino. It just would seem he would have a lot of opportunities, it would seem, if that was if he was into stepping out and doing whatever. It would seem like he would have had ample opportunity to do so. So, yeah, it would not surprise me at all.
Okay. Thanks. Is the call from Alabama still there?
Yeah, I'm here. I would say probably so. He seemed to me like a suave type of guy, but I can't make a clear decision on whether he would be a player or not. But I would say about dressing his women, I make sure his women are on their game. You know, they represent him, and so if you're gonna be out there representing me, I want you to represent me well. So I kind of understand that part, but other than that, I don't have much to say.
Okay, thanks. That was just a question. He said he wanted to be a guardian of his own reputation.
Doesn't sound like the best illustration of black love to me, but maybe that's just my interpretation. I could be incorrect. Again, I would just say, go back to that line. We do a lot of showing off on the system of white supremacy to hide a lot of the pain and strain, fear that we feel as a result of being subject to white terrorists. A lot of showing off and doing a lot of things. And he said he liked to brag. He said so. We do a lot of things to try to make ourselves stand out from other black people and be like, oh, you don't have this, or I have that. And that really hasn't done anything but give white people a lot of our money and keep us under the system of racism, white supremacy. We will wrap up. We should have, I think, about 3 discs left, and we should be done with the book. So 2 or 3 more of these to go. Next week, session number 13, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. The compensatory call-in will be tomorrow evening, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Hopefully I'll figure out what is up with the lines and clear. Yeah, we'll figure out whatever the issue is with the line. Likely white people. He had to have that cleared up hopefully by tomorrow evening for the compensatory call-in. News reports from the past 7 days and workplace racism. Definitely looking forward to continuing the dialogue. Thanks all for tuning in. We will be back many shows for the upcoming week and weekend. Invest if you think the program is constructive. You can follow on Twitter @UntilJustice, @UntilJustice. Email if you have suggestions, gripes, complaints, confusion, things that you want to get in. Anybody want to do the prayer to wrap things up?
I'll do it.
Okay.
Hello?
We'll be back tomorrow. Yes, sir. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks all for tuning in, and invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Caller in Alabama, take it away.
Creator, please protect us through our travels and our days dealing with white supremacists, racists, and please remove the burden of white supremacy from the globe. Amen.
Ashe.
Ashe. Context of White Supremacy signing out. Thank you all for tuning in.
I'm a victim, brother.
Problem. You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
Even my conditioning has been conditioned.